Chapter 21. Philosophy of the Mind Creating Its Own Reality, Different Schools of Thought. Rama said, Venerable sage who is acquainted with the mysteries of all things, I have a great question swelling in my heart like a huge surge of the sea. How is it, sage, that my foulness could attach to the mind when it is situated in eternal purity of the infinite spirit unbounded by time and space? Again, as there is nothing, there never was anything, and there never will be anything other than the entity of the Holy One. How and from where could this foulness come in him? Vasistha answered, Well said, Rama. I see that your understanding is approaching the way to your liberation, and exhaling the sweetness of the blossom of the Nandana garden of paradise. I see your understanding is capable of judging both deductively reason and inductively observation, and is likely to attain that acme which was gained by the god Shankara, Shiva, and others. However, it is not yet the proper time and place for you to ask this question. It should be asked when I come to the conclusion of the subject. You should ask this question when I come to the conclusion, and it will be demonstrated to you as clearly as the location of a place on the map placed in the palm of your hand. Your question will most be suitable at the end, just as the sound of the peacock and swan are best suited to the rainy season in autumn. The blueness of the sky is pleasant to look upon at the end of the rainy weather, but it is odd to speak of during the rain. It is best to investigate into the mind by the nature of its act and operations that tend to be the cause of the repeated birth of mankind. The mind by its nature has the power of thinking, and as determined by the seeker of salvation, the mind leads all the organ and body part to their several actions. Men learned in scriptures and eloquent in speech have been given various names to the mind in different systems of philosophy, according to the mind's various perceptive faculties and different functions and operations in the body. Whatever nature the mind assumes by the fickleness of its thought, it receives the same name and nature for itself, just like the same fleeting air receives from blowing different smells. The mind delights itself with thoughts of its desired objects and assimilating itself into their nature. It receives the same form in which it delights and which it assumes to itself in its imagination. The body, being subject to the mind, is molded in the same form as the mind, just as wind is perfumed by the fragrance of the flower bed through which it passes. The inner senses being excited actuate the outward organs of sense in their own ways, just as the exciting motion of winds drives the dust of the earth before their course. The mind exerts its power to make the external organs perform their several functions, just as flying winds drive dust in different directions. Such are the acts of the mind, which is said to be the root of action, and these combine together as inseparably as the flower and its fragrance. Whatever nature the mind adapts to itself by its accustomed habit, the same shoots forth in the form of the mind two kinds of movement, will and action. The mind does its action and brings about the result by its diligent application. In the same way, the mind enjoys the result and enslaves itself to the enjoyment. The mind understands what is its right course, which is whatever agrees with its temperament, and the mind knows for certain that there is no other way to its real good other than its accustomed course. Minds of different caste follow different pursuits according to their particular inclinations. Minds employ themselves in the acquisition of wealth and virtue, desired objects and liberation according to whatever they think is their best choice. Kapila, Samkhya philosophers say the mind is pure substance, like immaterial consciousness, and this view is adapted in their philosophy and scriptures. These men, relying on the error of their own hypothesis, teach their supposed view of the mind to others as the only light to guide them in the way of their salvation. But the teachers of Vedanta doctrines acknowledge the mind as Brahma himself and preach peace and self-control as the only means to attain liberation. The authoritative assertion of Vedanta is that there is no other way to the salvation of the supposed mind, and it is an assumed dogma in other schools also. The Vijnana Vada philosophers also have ascertained and upheld peace and self-government as a leader to liberation, but this too is an expression of their false understanding. Thus all sects give out their own views in the false rules that they have adopted for the salvation of their supposed minds. Each school asserts that there is no other way to salvation, except what they lay down. So Buddhists and other sectarians propose a variety of fictitious methods for the liberation of the mind out of their arbitrary will in their respective scriptures. The arbitrary rules of the learned, and those unsupported by the Shruti scriptures, are as numerous and varying from one another as bubbles in clear water. Mighty Rama, know that the mind is the source of all these rules and methods, just as the sea is the source of every kind of gem. There is no innate sweetness in sugar cane or bitterness in the neem leaf, both of which are sucked by insects. There are no heat or cold inherent in the sun or moon. It is the intrinsic habit of the mind that makes a difference. Thus those who want to enjoy the unadulterated happiness of their souls should habituate their minds to assimilate themselves to that happy state, and they are sure to have the same. The mind having fled from the sphere of the phenomenal world, being exempt from all its pleasure and pain, like a young bird with feathers flying in the air by casting off its eggshell and leaving its cage below. O sinless Rama, cherish no fondness for the phenomenal world, which is an unreal illusion full of fear and unholiness stretched out to catch the mind. The wise describe our consciousness of the world as a magic scene, Maya, an appearance of ignorance, avidya, a mere thought and the cause and effect of our acts. Know that the delusive mind stretches the visible world before you, therefore rub it off from the mind like dirty mud. This visible appearance that naturally appears before you in the form of the world is called a product of ignorance by the wise. Men being deluded by it are at a loss to know their real good, like the blinded eyes incapable of seeing the brightness of the day. Contemplation of objects presents phenomena to our view, like trees in the empty sky. Being without thought of objects removes their images from inner and outer sight. The abstract meditation of the thoughtful yogi weakens the outward impression, and by disassociating the soul from all external things, keeps it steady and calm in itself. The mind, by removing its attention from unreal sights, is inclined to the right view of things and produces clarity of understanding and a detached tranquility of the soul. The mind that regards neither realities nor unrealities, and is unconscious to pleasure and pain, feels itself the delight of its singleness or unity. Application of the mind to unworthy thoughts and to the internal or external sides of things blocks the soul from tasting the sweets of its unity. The mind that is subject to endless desires is like the clear sky hidden by clouds. Such a mind wanders into the maze of doubt between truth and untruth, such as supposing the rope to be the serpent. Man, by the mist of his doubts, obstructs his own sight of the clear sky of his consciousness, but he is unaware of his error's obstruction and indulges the fancies of imagination that adds to his error. He takes the true, incorruptible, and supreme Brahma in a different light, as one mistakes one thing for another in the dark or in his error. When man is rid of his false imagination, he comes to the knowledge of true God and his happiness, like one freed from his false apprehension of a tiger in a thicket is set at rest within himself. The imaginary monster of one's imprisonment in the emptiness of the body is dispersed by his insight into it, just as the fear of a lion lurking in the jungle is removed upon finding no such thing. So when you look deeply, you will find no bondage in the world. The notion that this is the world and this is myself are only errors of the mind. Flight of fancy fills the mind with illusions of good and evil, just as the shade of evening presents apparitions of a Tala ghost to little children. Our fancies alight on us at one time and depart at another. They assume different forms at will, just like our consorts act the part of our wives in our youth and nurses in our old age. She acts the part of a housewife in her management of household affairs, and she is taken as a mistress when she embraces us in her bosom. Like an actress, the mind forgets to display its part when it plays another, so everybody is absorbed in the thoughts he has in his head and neglects other thoughts which are absent. The ignorant do not perceive the self-same unity in all things he sees in the world. They are everything in the light of ideas they have imprinted in their minds. They also meet with results in the forms they have in mind, even though in reality they are not what they seem to be, nor are they entirely false. Man sees everything in the same manner in which he thinks it in himself. If his fancy is an elephant in the sky, he sees elephants in the clouds. In his thoughts, he believes these elephants are pursuing their mates, so it is the thought that gives the outward form of things. Rama, repel your drowsiness and behold the Supreme Self in your soul. Be like a bright jewel by repelling the shadows of all external things. It is impossible, O Rama, that one so enlightened as you will receive the reflection of the world as a dull matter like others do. Being certain of its immateriality, never taint your mind with its outward coloring or the knowledge of its reality, but know the reflection of the world is in no way distinct from the Supreme Spirit. Keep in your mind that being who is without beginning or end, and meditate on the Spirit in spirit. Do not let the reflections of your mind stain the pure crystal of your soul. Be on your guard so you never allow the reflection of your mind to taint the clear crystal of your soul. Remain unmindful of phenomena and do not regard any worldly desire. Chapter 22. Qualities of the Mind Resting in Supreme Joy. Vasistha continued, men of sound judgment are free from mental disturbance and are perfect in their mastery over themselves by restraining the flight of the mind and fastening it to its inner awareness. They swerve from the sight of phenomena as unworthy of their notice. They seek knowledge of their chief good. They behold the all-seeing God in their mental and external sights and have no perception of unintelligent phenomena. They are dormant amidst the thick gloom of error spreading over the confused path of life. They are awake under the transcendent light of divine knowledge that requires the vigilance of the living. They are utterly indifferent to the sweet pleasures of the life, as they are also indifferent to the cheerless prospect of future enjoyment. They are mixed with the water of spiritual unity and in boundless ocean of omnipresence. By their rigorous austerities resembling the vigorous heat of the sun, they melt away like ice in a river. At the disappearance of their ignorance, all their restless desires and passions are set to rest, like the turbulent waves of rivers subside of themselves in the absence of stormy clouds. The net of desires that ensnares men like birds in traps is cut asunder by a spirit of dispassion, just like the meshes of a net are torn apart by a mouse's teeth. As the seeds of kata fruit serve to purify foul water, so philosophy tends to cleanse human nature of its error. The mind that is free from passion, from worldly connection and contention, and from dependence on anyone or anything, is also liberated from the bonds of ignorance and error, like a bird set free from its cage. When the disturbances of doubts are settled and the wandering of curiosity is over, then the full moon of internal fullness sheds its light over the mind. As the mind's true greatness appears after it sets from the height of its dignity and high-mindedness, so it begins to have its equanimity in a state resembling the calm sea after a storm. As long as the shadow of concern hangs over the mind, it is darkened and stupefied and broken in the heart, until the sun of renunciation rises to dispel its gloom. The sunshine of consciousness makes the lotus bed of intelligence shine in its pure luster, and unfolds the foliage of its virtue before the dawning light above it. Intelligence is charmer of hearts and delighter of all in the world. It is fostered by the quality of goodness, just as the moon becomes full by her increasing digits. What more shall I say on this subject, other than he who knows the knowable God has his mind expanded like the sphere of heaven, which has no beginning or end. The mind enlightened by reasoning is as exalted in its nature as to take pity on even the gods Hari, Hara, Brahma, and Indra. The gods continually seeking to quench their thirst from waters appearing in the mirage, like the thirsting deer running to them by mistake, are far from tasting the happiness of egoistic yogis. Desire in the hearts of all beings subject them to repeated birth and death, causing the ignorant but not the wise to appear and disappear like waves on the sea. The world presents no other show in its course except that of the appearance and disappearance of bodies. Now they are seen to move about as a sport of time, and then fall as prey to it forever. But the spiritual body is neither born nor dies in this world. It is not affected by the decoration or loss of the material body, but remains unchanged as the emptiness of a pot, both when it exists and when it is broken to pieces. As understanding rises with its cooling moonbeams within us, it dispels the mist of false desires rising before us like a mirage in a dreary desert. The spectacle of the world presents its dusky appearance to our view only as long as we do not consider the questions. What am I, and what are all these about me? He sees rightly who sees his body as an apparition of his heir and abode of all evils, and that his body does not serve the spiritual meditation of his soul and his Maker. He sees rightly who sees that his body is the source of all the pain and pleasure which afflict at different times and places, and that the body does not answer his purpose of spiritual edification. He sees rightly who sees the one ego pervading infinite space and time as the source of all accidents and events that constantly take place in them. He knows rightly who knows the ego to be as minute as a millionth or billionth part of a point of a hair, and pervading the entire infinity of space and eternity of time. He perceives rightly who perceives the universal soul to permeate all the various objects of his sight, and knows them as sparks of the light of consciousness. He perceives rightly who perceives within himself the omnipotence of the infinite spirit present in all states and conditions of being, and the same consciousness to abide in and preside over all. He understands rightly who understands by his wisdom that he is not his body that is subject to disease, danger, fear, and anxieties, and the pain and pangs of old age and death. He understands rightly who understands his soul as stretching above and below and all about him, whose magnitude has no bounds nor equal to it. He knows full well who sees his soul as a string to which all things are strung like pearls on a necklace, and that is not the mind or heart that is seated in the brain or bosom. He thinks rightly who imagines neither himself nor anything else as existent except the imperishable Brahman, and who knows himself as living between reality and unreality. He is right who beholds what they call the three worlds to be only parts of his self, and that the three worlds have been rolling about like him on the waves of the sea. He is wise who looks with pity upon the frail world, and who has compassion for the earth as his younger sister. The great soul who has withdrawn his mind from the earth looks brightly upon the earth by repressing his reliance on the interest of his individual ego. He sees the truth who finds his body and the whole world filled by the colossal figure of consciousness without the opposition of any sensible object. He who looks on the states of misery and happiness that attend worldly life as only the fluctuating conditions of ego has no cause to regret or rejoice at them. He is the right-sighted man who sees himself situated in a world filled with divine spirit. He has nothing to desire or dislike in this state of existence. He is the discerning man who has weakened his estimation and dislike of what is desirable and disgusting to him in his world, and who sees the world as full of the essence of that being whose nature is beyond comprehension and conception. That man of great soul is a great God whose soul, like the all-pervading sky, extends over all and penetrates through every state of existence without receiving the color dye of any. I bow down to that great soul who has passed beyond the states of light, darkness, and fancy. I bow down to Shiva of transcendental understanding, whose faculties are wholly engrossed in meditation of the eternal being, who presides over the creation, destruction, and preservation of the universe, and who is manifest in all the various wonderful and beautiful grandeurs of nature. Chapter 23. The Wonders Within the Realm of the Body. Vasistha continued, "The man liberated in this life and settled in the supreme state of joy is not tarnished by reigning over the realm of his body and turning about like a wheel. The body of a wise man is like a princedom to him, calculated for his benefit and of no disadvantage. It is comparable to the dwelling of a holy hermit for the consummation of his efforts in liberation." Rama said, "O great sage, how can you call the body to be the dominion of man, and how can a yogi have this princely joy in it?" Vasistha replied, "Beautiful is this city of the body. Being enlightened by the light of the mind, it is filled with every good to mankind, and it produces endless blessing in both worlds. The eyes are the windows of the city, letting out the light for the sight of distant worlds. The two arms are like the two hinges on the city gate, with hands like latches reaching to the knees. The hairs on the body are like moss and grass on the wall, and the porous skin resembles the netted covering of the palace. Thighs and legs are like the columns of a building, and the feet with ankles and toes are like pedestals of the column. Lines marked under the soles of the feet are like inscriptions marked on the foundation stone and upon the base of column pedestals. The outer skin that covers flesh, marrow, veins, and arteries, and the joints of the body are like the beautiful plaster of the building hiding the mortar and the bricks inside. The middle part of the body above the two thick thighs contains the aqueducts, beset by hairy bushes about them, and like rivers running amidst a city between rows of trees on both sides of the bank. The face is the royal garden beautified by eyebrows, forehead, and lips. Glances of the eyes are like blooming lotuses, and the cheeks are like flat plains on it. The broad bosom is like a lake with nipples like lotus buds. Streaks of hair on the breast are as its herbage, and the shoulders are the rocks projecting from it. The belly is a storehouse, eager to receive the delicious articles of food. The long lungs of the throat are blown loudly by internal wind. The bosom is considered to be the treasury where jewels are kept. The 9 openings of the body serve as so many windows for the citizens to breathe. There is the open mouth like the open doorway, with its teeth slightly seen at its grating. The tongue moving in the door like a naked sword is like the tongue of goddess Kali, thrust out when she devours her food. The ear holes are covered by hair like long grass, and the broad back resembles a large plain surrounded by rows of trees on its border. The 2 private passages serve as sewers and drains in the city to let out its dirt. The heart is the garden ground where passions promenade like ladies. Here understanding is bound in chains like a prisoner, and the organs of senses are let loose as monkeys to play about. The face is like a flower garden, its smiles are its blossoming blossoms. The life of the man who knows the proper use of his body and mind is prosperous in everything. It is attended by happiness and advantage and no disadvantage whatever. The body is the source of infinite trouble to the ignorant, but it is the fountain of infinite happiness to the wise man. Its loss is no loss to the wise, but its continuance is the cause of continued happiness to the wise man. The body serves as the chariot to the wise who can travel everywhere by riding on it. The body of a wise man can produce and procure everything conducive to his welfare and liberation. Having a body is of no disadvantage to the wise man. He can use it to obtain everything, all the objects of his hearing and seeing, of his touch and smelling, and his friends in prosperity. It is true that the body is subject to a great amount of pain and pleasure, but a wise man can well bear with them. A wise man reigns over the dominion of his body without any pain or trouble in the same manner as one remains the lord of his health without any anxiety or disturbance. He is not addicted to licentiousness like the high-spirited horse. He is not subject to greed after some poisonous plant, so he does not part with the auspicious daughter of his prudence. The ignorant can see the cities of others, but not see the gaps and breaks of their own. It is better to root out the fears of our worldly enemies' passions from the heart than live under their subjection. Beware of diving into the perilous river that flows fast by the dreary forest of this world with its currents of desire, whirlpools of greed, and sharks of temporal enjoyment. Men often bathe their outer bodies in holy streams without looking to the purification of their inner souls. They shave their hair where rivers meet the sea in hopes of obtaining their object. All sensual people are adverse to the unseen happiness of the next world, and dwell on the pleasure of their own imagination in the inner recesses of their mind. The city of the body is pleasant to one acquainted with the spiritual nature, because he deems it as the paradise of Indra, filled with pleasurable fruit, as well as the fruit of immortality. All things depend on the existence of the city of the body, yet nothing is lost by its loss, since the mind is the seat of everything. These bodily cities that fill the earth cannot be unpleasant to anyone. The wise man loses nothing when he loses the citadel of his body, just as the emptiness in a vessel is never lost when the vessel breaks. As the air in a pot is not felt by touch like the pot itself, so is the living soul that resides in the city of the body. The omnipresent soul situated in this body enjoys all worldly enjoyments until at last it comes to partake of the joy of liberation, which is its main object. The soul does all action, yet it is no doer of them, but remains as witness of whatever is done by the body, and sometimes presides over the actions actually done by it. The playful mind rides on the swift car of the body, like mounting on a carriage to get to one's destination, and passes in its unimpeded course to a distant journey. Seated there, the mind plays with its favorite and lovely objects of desire that are seated in the heart as its mistress. These two lovers, mind and heart, will and desire, reside side by side in the same body, just as the moon and the star, Vishaka, happily remain gladly in the same lunar mansion. The sage, like the sun, looks down from above the earth's atmosphere onto the host of mortals who have been cut down by misery. Like heaps of brambles and branches scattered in the woods, the sage has full satisfaction of his desire and full possession of his best riches. He shines like the full moon without fear of waning. The worldly enjoyment of the wise do not tend to spoil their nature, just as the poisonous drink of Shiva was not capable of doing him any injury. The food that is one's habit is as gratifying to him as a thief who by long acquaintance forgets his thievishness and becomes friendly to his neighbor. The wise man looks upon the separation of his friends and possessions in the light of the departure of the visiting men and women, or actors and actresses at the end of a play in a theater. As passengers chance to meet unexpectedly on their way to see a play, so the wise people looked unconcernedly at their meeting and separation from the occurrence of life. As our eyesight falls indifferently on all objects about us, so the wise man looks unconcernedly upon all of life's things and transactions. The wise man is self-sufficient in all conditions of life. He neither rejects the earthly blessings that are presented to him, nor does he long or strive hard for what is denied to him. The regret of longing after what one does not possess, like the fear of losing what he possesses, does not trouble the mind of the wise. Like the plumes of a dancing peacock do not shake the unshaken mountain. The wise man reigns like a monarch, free from all fears and doubts, devoid of all cares and curiosity, and with a mind free from false fancies. The soul that is immeasurable in itself is situated in the Supreme Soul, just like the boundless milky ocean is contained in the body of the one universal ocean. Those who are sober in their minds and tranquil in their spirits laugh to scorn the vile beast of sensuality as being madmen, as there are those who have debased themselves in the state of mean reptiles by the meanness of their sensual appetites. The sensualist, eager to gratify his senses, is as much ridiculed by the wise man as a man who makes a woman deserted by another is derided by his tribe. The unwise man becomes wise by renouncing all the pleasure of his body and subduing the emotion of his mind by his reason, just like a rider subdues an uncontrollable elephant by a goad in his hand. He whose mind is bent on the enjoyment of bodily pleasures should first of all check that inclination, just like they pull poisonous plants from the ground. The well-governed mind, once let loose, returns to its former habits like a spoiled boy. Like a tree withered in summer heat grows luxuriant at a slight rainfall. That which is full out of its time does not become fuller in its season. Like the river that is ever full receives no addition over its fullness in the rain. The mind that is naturally greedy wishes for more with all its fullness. Like the sea with enough water to flood the earth receives rain waters and the outpouring of innumerable rivers in its unsatisfied womb. The mind that is restrained in its desire is gladdened with little gains, and these being increased are reckoned as blessings by the restrained mind. A captive prince, who when he was free was unsatisfied with his realm, is content with his morsel of bread when freed. You must chastise your reprobate members in mind with the writing of your hands, gnashing of your teeth, and twisting of your limbs and body. The brave and wise man who intends to overcome his enemies must first of all strive to subdue the internal enemies of his own heart and mind and the members of his body. On this earth, those men are reckoned the most prosperous and the most disposed in their mind who have the courage to govern their mind instead of being governed by them. I revere those pure and holy men who have quelled the huge and crooked serpent of their minds, lying coiled in the cave of their heart, and who rest in the inner tranquility and serenity of their souls. Chapter 24. The Non-Entity of the Mind. Vasistha continued, The vast domain of death in the region of hell is full with the furious elephants of our sins, and the uncontrollable enemies of the senses with the arrows of desire. Our senses, being the source of all misdeeds and wicked actions, are our invincible enemies. They are the ungrateful miscreants working against the body in which they have found their refuge. Wandering senses, like flying birds, have found their nest in the body from where, with outstretched wings of right and wrong, they pounce on their prey like vultures. He who can trap these greedy birds of the senses under the snare of right reason is never ensnared in the trap of sin, but breaks its bonds as an elephant does its chains. He who indulges himself in sensual pleasure, which at first are pleasant, will be disgusted with them in the process of time. He who possesses the treasure of knowledge in his frail body is not overcome by his inner enemies of sensual appetites. The kings of earth are not as happy in their earthly citadels as the lords of the cities of their own bodies and the masters of their own mind. He who has brought his senses under his slavery and reduced the enemy of his mind to subjugation has the blossoms of his understanding ever blooming within him as in the spring meadow. He who has weakened the pride of his mind and subdued the enemies of his senses has his desires all shrunken like lotuses in cold water. So long as the demons of our desires infest the regions of our heart, we are unable to bring the mind under the subjugation of our knowledge of the True One. He is the faithful servant who acts according to the will of his master. He is the true minister who does good service to his prince. He is the best general who has command over the forces of his own body, and the best understanding is guided by reason. The wife is loved for her endearments, and the father is revered for his protection of the child. A friend is valued by his confidence in the mind for its wisdom. The mind is called our Father because it enlightens our understanding with the light of the Scriptures, and for leading us to perfection by losing itself in the Supreme Spirit. The mind that is well observed and considered all things, that is enlightened and firm in its belief, and is employed in laudable pursuits, is truly a valuable gem within the body. The mind, as a counselor of our good, teaches us how to cut down the tree of our transmigration and produce the tree of our future bliss. Such is the gem of the mind, O Rama, unless it is soiled by the dirt and filth of sin and vice. Then it requires washing and cleaning with the water of reason in order to throw its light on you. Be not dormant to cultivate reason as long as you abide in the dark abode of this world. Do not thrust yourself to every accident that awaits upon ignorant and unreasonable men. Do not overlook the mist of error that spreads over this world of illusion, abounding with multitudes of mishap and mischief. Try to cross the wide ocean of the world by riding on the strong boat of your reason, using your discrimination to chart the right course against the currents of your sensual desires. Know your body to be a frail flower and all its pleasure and pain to be unreal. So never take pleasure and pain for realities, as in the instance of the snare, snake, and the matting, but remain above sorrow for anything, as in the instance of Bhima and Basha. O high-minded Rama, give up your misjudgment of reality and of yourself, and of this and that thing. Direct your understanding to the knowledge of the reality which is beyond all these. Then, by forsaking your belief and reliance in the mind, continue in your course of eating and drinking as before. Chapter 25. The Story of Dhamma, Bala, and Kala, created by Demon King Sambara. Vasistha said, O intelligent Rama, who shines as the delight of mankind in this world, and endeavors to attain your chief good by the accomplishment of your best objects, do not let the example of demons Dhamma the snare and Bala the snake apply to your case. Try to extricate yourself from vain sorrowing by the lesson of fortitude as given in the story of Bhima and Basa. Rama asked, What is that parable of the snake and the snake which you say must not apply to my case? Please tell me in order to remove the sorrow of my mind and of all mankind. And what is that example of fortitude by Bhima and Basha that I should imitate in order to rid all earthly sorrow? Please tell me and enlighten me with your purifying words, like the roaring of rainy clouds serves to alleviate the summer heat of peacocks. Vasistha replied, Rama, hear me relate both of these stories so that you may derive the benefit of learning from their examples. There lived one Sambara, the chief of demons, and a profound sorcerer in an underground cavern filled with enchanting wonders like a sea of gems. He constructed a magic city in the sky with gardens and temples of gods, and artificial suns and moons emblazing its ceiling. It was decorated with rich stones resembling the gems of Sumuru Mountain. The demon's palace was full of opulence and treasures of every kind. The beauties in his harem vied with the celestial dames in their charming strains. The trees of his pleasure garden were shaded by an awning of bright moonbeams on high. Blue lotuses blooming in his bedroom made the blue-eyed maids of his court blush. Swans in the lake cackled about the beds of golden lotuses in them. The high branches of golden plants bore blossoms of artificial lotuses, and rows of karanga trees dropped down showers of mandaro flowers on the ground. His garden house consisted of both cold and hot bath, and refrigerators and fireplaces for hot and cold season. The turku weapons of the demons had baffled the arms of Indra himself. Flower gardens on all sides surpassed the mandara groves of paradise. Demon magic skill had planted rows of sandalwood trees with their encircling snakes all around. The inner compound was strewn over with gold dust and vanquished the glory of heaven. The palace courtyard was covered with heaps of flowers up to the knee. The earthen figure of Shiva that was exposed for show surpassed the image of Hari Vishnu, holding his discus in the mace. Jewels sparkling like fireflies in the inside apartment resembled the twinkling stars in the arena of heaven. The dark night of the subterranean dwelling was illuminated by 100 moonlights like the starry heaven, and he chanted his marital songs before his idol deity. His magical elephant drove away Indra's Aravata, and his inner apartment contained a hoard of precious treasures from the 3 worlds. All wealth, prosperity, grandeur, and dignity paid their homage to him. The whole host of demons honored him as their commander. The protection of his arms gave shelter to the whole body of demons. He was the receptacle of all sound judgment, and the reservoir of every kind of treasure. This destroyer of gods, devas, and suras had a gigantic and terrific appearance. He commanded a large army of demons to defeat the deities. Whenever this magician demigod went to sleep or left for somewhere out of the city, the gods sought every opportunity to harass a demonic force. This enraged Sambara to such a degree that he broke trees in his rage, and he ordered his generals to protect his legions. The gods, finding their opportunity, killed the demons one by one, like hawks pounce and kill the feeble and timid sparrows. The king of the demons then appointed other generals over his army, and they were as swift-footed and hoarse-sounding as the waves of the sea. When the leader of the demon band pursued his enemies of their station above the heavens, the gods also destroyed them in a short time. The gods fled from their heavenly abode for fear of them, like timid deer flying in the thick thickets of the sight of Shiva's and Gauri's bull. The gods were weakened with weeping, and the faces of Apsara nymphs were covered in tears. The demons saw the heavenly abode abandoned by the celestials, as if the desolation of the world. He wandered about in his rage, plundering, and took away all the valuables of the palace. He burnt down the cities of the rulers of heaven, and then returned to his own abode. The enmity between the deities and demons were so intense on both sides that it forced the gods to quit their heavenly abodes and hide in distant parts of the world. But the enraged gods succeeded at last by their perseverance to defeat and slay all the generals and combatants that Sambara set against them. Then the defeated demon gave vent to his fury, and began to breathe out living fire from his nostrils like a burning mountain. After much searching in the 3 worlds, he found the hiding place of the gods, as a wicked man succeeds in his purpose by his best endeavors. Then, to protect his army, he produced by his sorcery 3 very strong and fearful demons with hideous appearances like that of death. These horrible leaders of his army, being produced in his magic, flew upward with their enormous bodies resembling the flying mountains of old. They had the names of Dhamma, the snare, Bala, the snake, and Kata, the mad, given them for entrapping, enfolding, and enwrapping the enemy according to the demon's wish. They were beings without previous birth and devoid of changing desire. The lack of their prior act made them move about as freely as spiritual beings in one uniform tenor of their course. These were not born like men from the seeds of their previous acts with solid and substantial body. They were mere artificial forces in airy forms, copies of images in the demon Sambara's mind. Being born in this way, they followed events as they happened like blind sheep, just like a boy moves his limbs when he is not in sound sleep. These 3 demon generals performed actions devoid of subtle karmic impressions and self or egoism. They did not know the sudden attack of the enemy on them or their attack on the enemy. They did not know running away from battle. They did not know birth or death, victory or defeat, or war, as a matter of fact, but they attacked the enemy in front of them with blows that turned even mountains into dust. Sambara was pleased with them. He was confident that with their help he would defeat the enemy. Sambara was confident that his army, strong and stable, under the shades of the soldiers of the 3 demons, could withstand the onslaught of the gods, just as Mount Meru stands firm in spite of the blows of the teeth of the elephants carrying earth from the 8 quarters. Chapter 26. Description of battle between gods and demons. Vasistha continued. So thinking, the chief of the demons dispatched his generals Dhamma, Bala, and Kata to lead his armies to destroy the gods upon earth. The demonic army rose out of the foaming sea in infernal caverns in full armor and wielding fiendish arms. Then bursting forth with hideous noise, the demon soldiers soared aloft with their huge bodies like mountains flying on high. Their monstrous and mountainous bodies hid the disk of the sun in the sky, and their stretching arms smote him of his rays. They increased in number and size under the leadership of Dhamma, Bala, and Kala. Then the dreadful host of the celestials issued out from the forests and caverns of heavenly Mount Meru like torrents of a great deluge. The forces under the flags of gods and demons fought together with such obstinacy that it seemed to be untimely and deadly struggle between the gods and demons as during the prior world. The heads of decapitated warriors decorated with shining earrings fell down on the ground like the orbs of the sun and moon, which being shorn of their beams as at the end of the world were rolling in the great abyss of chaos. Heroes hurled huge hills with a hoarse noise of roaring lions. Hills were blown up and down by the blast of an all-destroying tornado. Warriors' broken weapons fell on mountain tops and were ground to granules. They fell like hailstones upon lions that had been resting on their shades below. The sparks of fire that flew about from the clashing of the weapons were like the scattered stars of the sky flying at random on the last day of disillusion. Vatala ghosts as big as tala palm trees were beating the tala time of their giddy dance, with the tali clapping on their palms, dancing over heaps of carnage, floating on floods of blood, flowing like a bloody sea on the surface of the earth. Showers of flowing blood put down the flying dust on the battlefield. Numbers of crowned heads separated from their bodies glistened among the clouds like so many stars sparkling in the sky. Demons filled all sides, blazing like burning sun with their luminous body. They held tall kalpa branches in their hand to strike the enemy and used to break down the tops and peaks of the mountain. They ran about with their swinging swords in hand, breaking down buildings by the speed of their motion like blasts of a gale. The rocks they hurled at the enemy were reduced to dust, like the ashes of a burning mountain. The gods also pursued them like sacrificial horses, driving the weaponless demons like clouds before the storm. They fell upon and laid hold of them like cats pouncing upon rats, seizing them for their prey. Meanwhile, demons also seized God like bears lay hold of men climbing tall trees with fear. Thus gods and demigods dashed against one another, like forest trees in a storm strike each other with their branching arms, and scattered the flowers of bloodshed on both sides. Their broken weapons lay scattered on all sides, like heap of flowers lying on the sides of the hill after a strong gale has passed. There was a close fight between armies, a confused noise filling the vault of the sky, which like the hollow of an undama tree resounded to the combined hum of gnats rumbling within. The elephants that ruled the different quarters of the sky sent their loud roars, answering the tremendous noise of the world-destroying cloud. The thickened air grew as hard as the solid earth with the gathering clouds, and thickened clouds, so dense a fist could grab them, were heavy and slow in their motion. Broken weapons repelled by war chariots hit against the hills and emitting a rattling noise from their inner hollowness, like the discordant sounds of a chorus. Mountain forests were set on fire by fiery weapons, and burning rocks melted down their lava with a noise as dreadful as that of the volcanic Mount Meru, with its melting gold and blazing with the brightness of the 12 suns of the zodiac. The clamor of battle was like that of the beating waves of a boisterous ocean, filling the vast deep of the earth, resounding hoarsely by their impact. Demons hurled huge rocks that flew like birds in the air, with their flapping wings sounding like thunderclaps, while the hoarse noise of rocky caverns sounded like the deep-sounding ocean. The clamor of warfare resembled the rumbling of the ocean when it was churned by Mandara Mountain, and the clashing of weapons sounded like the gods clapping their hands in their revelry for the ambrosial nectar. In this war between the two armies, the haughty demons gained the day and laid waste to the cities and villages of the god, together with their lands of hills and forest. The mountainous bodies of demons were also pierced by the gods' great weapons, and the roof of heaven was filled with flying weapons flung by the hands of both parties. Bursting rockets broke the peaks and pinnacles of rocks by the hundreds. The flying arrows pierced the face on both gods and demigods. Whirling discs lopped off the heads of the warriors like blades of grass, and the clamor of the armies rolled with an uproar in the midway sky. Struck by flying weapons, heavenly charioteers fell upon the ground, and their celestial cities were deluged by the hydraulic engines of the demons. Flights of swords, spears, and lances flew in the air like rivers running down mountainsides. The vault of heaven was filled with war whoops and the shouts of the combatants. The palaces of the ruling gods were falling under the blows of demons from behind. Their female apartments echoed with the lamentations and jingling bells of the goddesses. The stream of flying weapons from the demons washed the bodies of fighting men with blood, making them fly out from the battlefield with hideous cries. Death was now lurking behind, now hovering over the heads of the gods and leaders of the armies, like a black bee now sulking in and then flitting over the lotuses. Armies on both sides were defeated by the blows of the gods and demigods in the battlefield. Demons flew in the air like winged mountains, moving around the sky, making a whizzing rustle that was dreadful to hear. The mountainous bodies of the demons, pierced by the gods' weapons, were gushing out with streams of blood that converted the earth below to crimson sea and tinged the air with purple clouds over the mountain heights. Many countries and cities, villages, forests, vales and dales were laid waste, and innumerable demons, elephants, horses, and human beings were put to death. Also numbers of elephants were pierced with long and pointed shafts of steel and iron, and the bodies of huge Airavatas were bruised by the blows of steeled fists. Flights of arrows, falling in showers like flood rains, crushed the top of the mountain. The friction of thunderbolts broke down the bodies of the mountainous giants. Furious flames of heavenly fire burned the bodies of the infernal host, who in their turn quenched the flame with the waterspouts drawn out of their underground deep. Enraged demons flung up and hurled huge hails against the gods, falling fires which, like a wild conflagration, melted the hard stones to liquid water. The shadow of the demons' weapons spread a dark night in the sky, which the gods destroyed by the artificial flame of lightning, blazing like so many suns in heaven. The fire of the lightning dried up the waters of the raining clouds, and the clashing of arms emitted a shower of fire on all sides. The shower of thunder arms broke down the battery of mountain ramparts, and the sleep weapon of slumber dispelled by that of its counteraction. Some bore the sign weapon, while others held the Brahmastra, the invincible weapon of warfare that dispels the darkness of the field by its flashing. The air was filled with shells and shots fired by firearms. Machines for hurling stones crushed the missile weapons of fire. War chariots with their uplifted flags and moon-like discs moved like clouds about the horizon, while their wheels rolled with loud roaring under the roof of heaven. The constant thunder of heaven were killing demons in numbers, who were again restored to life by the great art of Shukra that gave immortality to demonic spirits. Now the gods were victorious, and now flying away defeated. Now they looking to their good stars, and now to the inauspicious ones in vain. They looked upon heaven with uplifted heads and eyes for signs of good and evil, but from the heaven above the world on earth below appeared like a sea of blood. The rage of stubborn enmity between the worlds seemed like a forest of full-blown red kinsuka flowers, and like a sea of blood filled with mountains of dead bodies. Dead bodies hanging on tree branches appeared as the fruit moving to and fro by the breath of wind. The roof of the sky was filled with forests of long and large arrows, and with mountains of headless trunks with their 100 arms. As these torsos leaped and jumped in the air, they plucked the clouds and stars and the heavenly cars of the celestials with their numerous arms and hurled their mountain-like missile arms and clubs and arrows to the heaven. The sky was filled with the broken fragments of buildings falling from the 7 spheres of heaven. Their constant fall raised a noise like the roaring of flood clouds. These sounds were responded by the elephants of the deep Patala, with the bird of heaven, Garuda, was snatching gigantic demons as his prey. The dread of the demons drove the celestial deities, the Siddhas and the Sajas, deities who guard sacred rites, and the gods of the wind together with the Kanaras, Gandharvas, and Chinaras from all their different quarters to one indistinct side. Then there blew a tremendous tornado like the all-destroying north wind of universal desolation, laying waste the trees of the garden of paradise and threatening to destroy the gods. The thunder of heavens were splitting and breaking down mountains flung to the face of the sky. Chapter 27. Brahma advises the defeated gods to foster the demon's ego. Vasistha related, as the war of the gods and titans raged violently on both sides, and their bodies were cut by the other's weapons, streams of blood gushed out from their wounds like waterfalls in the Ganges basin. Gods caught into the snares of demigods groaned and roared aloud like lions. Bala with his stretching arms was crushing the bodies of the gods. Kala was harassing them in their unequal challenge with them. The demons waged their battle with the rage of the midday sun, and put to flight the Airavata elephant of Indra, the leader of the gods. Gods dropped down with their bodies gored with wounds and spotting with blood. Their armies fled on all sides like the currents of a river overflowing and breaking down its bank. Dhamma, Bala, and Kala pursued the flying and flee gods in the same manner as a raging fire runs after wood for its fuel. The demons sought and searched long after the gods in vain, for they had disappeared like deer and lions among the thickets after breaking loose from their traps. Failing to find the gods, the general Dhamma, Bala, and Kala returned with cheerful hearts to their chief in his home in the infernal region. The defeated gods halted a while, then prayed to Almighty Brahma in order to consult him on the means of gaining victory over the demons. Brahma then appeared to the blood-smeared gods with his purple countenance, like the bright and cooling moonbeams appear in the evening on the surface of the sea, colored with the crimson colors of the setting sun. The gods bowed down before Brahma and complained of the danger that was brought upon them by Sambara through his generals Dama, Bala, and Kala, whose doing they had fully described to him. The judging Brahma, having heard and considered all this, delivered the following encouraging words to the host of gods before him. Brahma said, "You will have to wait another 100,000 years before you can destroy Sambara under the arms of Hari Vishnu in an open engagement. Today you have been forced to flee by the demonic Dama, Bala, and Kala, who have been fighting with their magical arts. They are elated with pride at their great skills in warfare, but it will soon vanish like the shadow of a man in a mirror. These demons, led by their ambition to annoy you, will soon be reduced under your might like birds caught in a snare. The gods, being devoid of ambition, are free from the vicissitude of pain and pleasure. They have become invincible by destroying the enemy through their patience. Those who are caught and bound fast in the net of their ambition, and led away by the thread of their expectation, are surely defeated in their aims, just like birds are caught with a string. The learned, who are devoid of desire, and who are unattached to anything in their minds, are truly great and invincible, as nothing can elate or depress them at any time. A man, however great and experienced he may be, is easily overcome by a boy when he is enticed by his greed to pursue after everything. The knowledge that this is I, and these are mine, is the bane of human life. One with such knowledge of his self and egoism becomes the receptacle of evils like the sea of briny waters. He who confines his mind within a narrow limit for lack of his great and extended views is called dastardly and narrow-minded man in spite of all of his learning and wisdom. He who puts a limit on his soul, Atma, which is both unbounded and infinite, surely reduces his divine grace to minuteness by his own making. If there is anything in the world beside the one self that may be yours or worth your desire, you may long to have it. But all things being only parts of the universe, there is nothing particular for anyone to have or seek. Reliance on earthly things is the source of unhappiness, while our disinterest with all things is the fountain of everlasting joy. As long as the gods are independent of worldly things, they must remain invincible, but if they are dependent on them, they will perish like a swarm of gnats in the flame of a wildfire. It is man's inner desire that makes him miserable in himself and allows him to become subdued by others. Otherwise, worm-like man is as firm as a rock. Where there is any desire in the heart, it is thickened and hardened in time, just like everything in nature increases in its bulk in time, but not so things that are not in existence, such as the lack of desire. O Indra, if you want to cause their destruction, try to foster both ego-selfishness and the ambitions of Dhamma and others for their universal dominion. Know that it is greed that causes poverty and all dangers to mankind, just like the karanja tree is the source of its bitter and pernicious fruit. All those men who rove about under the bondage of greed have bid farewell to their happiness by subjecting themselves to misery. One may be very learned and well-informed in everything, and he also may be noble and a great man, but he is sure to be tied down by his greed, just like a lion is tied down by his chain. Greed is known as a trap of the mind, which is situated like a bird in the nest of the heart, as it is within the hollow of a tree of the body. A miserable man by his greed becomes an easy prey of the clutches of death, just like a bird is caught in a boy's net, and lies panting on the ground owing to its greed. You gods need not bear the burden of your weapons any more, nor toil and moil in the field of war any longer, but try your best to inflame the pernicious greed of your enemies to the utmost. Know, O chief of the gods, that no arm or weapon or any program or policy is able to defeat the enemy until they defeat themselves by their lack of patience and excess of their greed. Dhamma, Bala, and Kala have been elated with their success in warfare. Now they must cherish their ambition and foster their greed to their ruin. No sooner have these ignorant creatures of Sambara gained their high desires than you are sure to foil their vain attempts. Now you gods excite your enemies to the war by your policy of creating in them an ambition and intense desire for conquest. By this you will gain your object. They, being subject to their desire, will be easily subdued by you, for nobody that is led blindfolded by his desire in this world is ever master of himself. The path of this world is either even or rugged according to the good or restless desire of our heart. The heart is like the sea in its calm after the storm, when its waves are still as our subsided desires, or as boisterous as the stormy sea with our increasing greediness. Chapter 28. Description of renewed battle between gods and demons. Vasistha continued. Saying so, the god Brahma vanished from the sight of the gods, just as the wave of the sea retires and mixes with its water after having dashed and crashed against the shore. The gods, having heard Brahma's word, return to their respective homes as the breeze, bearing the lotus fragrant, blows it to the forest on all sides. They stayed in their delightful houses for some days, like bees resting themselves in the cells of flowers after their wandering. Having refreshed and invigorated themselves over the course of time, they gave the alarm of their rising with the beating of their drums, sounding like the peals of the last day. Immediately the demons rose from the infernal regions and met the gods midway in the air, and commenced their dreadful attack upon them. There was a clashing of armor, clattering of swords and arrows, the flashing of lances and spears, and the cracking of mallets and various other weapons, such as battle-axes and discuses, thunderbolts, and hurling of rocks and huge trees, and the like. There were many magical weapons that ran on all sides like the torrents of rivers, while rocks and hills, high mountains and huge trees were flung and hurled from both sides, filling the earth with confused noise and rumbling. The encampment of the gods was beset by a magical flood of demons resembling the Ganges River, while showers of firearms and missiles of all sorts were hurled upon their heads from above. Many big bodies of gods and demons rose and fought and fell by turns, like the elemental bodies of earth and other elements rise and disappear from the view by the act of illusion or maya. Big bombs broke the heads of mountains, and the earth became a vast sheet of blood like a Red Sea. Heaps of dead bodies on both sides rose like forests to the face of heaven. Living lions with iron bodies, rows of saw-like teeth, and nails white as casa flowers were let loose by the magic art to roam rampant in the airy field. They devoured the stone flung by the gods and demons, and burst out into shells and shots and many other weapons. Serpentine weapons flew with their mountainous shapes in the ocean of the sky. Their eyes flashed with their venomous heat, burning with the fire of the 12 suns in the last day of desolation. A hydraulic engine sent forth floods of weapons, whirling like whirlpools and sounding loud as a rattling thunder, sweeping hills and rocks in their currents. Stone missiles thrown by the Garuda engine to the gods' aerial battlefield emitted at intervals water and fire, sometimes shining as the sun, and at others becoming altogether dark. Garuda weapons flew and roared in the sky, and firearms spread a conflict of burning hills above. The god towers burned and fell upon the earth, and the world became an unendurable as it is a conflagration on the last day. Demons jumped up to the sky from the surface of the earth as birds fly to heaven from mountain tops. Gods fell violently on the earth like pieces of rock plummeting to the ground. Long weapons sticking in the bodies of gods and demons were like bushes with their burning pain. Their big statures appeared like rocks decorated with trees growing on them. Gods and demons, wandering with their mountainous bodies, all streaming in blood, appeared like the evening clouds of heaven pouring the purple flood of the celestial Mandakini River, the Milky Way. Showers of weapons fell like waterfalls or rain showers, and the tide of thunder flowed as fast as the fall of meteoric fire in haphazard confusion. Those skilled in the arts were pouring floods of purple fluids mixed with the red clay of mountains from the pipes of elephant trunks, just like they sprinkle the festive water of holy mixed with red powder through a syringe. Gods and demons, though worried by one another, did not yet give up their hope of victory, but hurled weapons from their hands to harass each other. Riding on the broad backs of big elephants, they wandered in the air, spreading their brightness all around. Then they wandered in the sky like flights of inauspicious locusts, their bodies pierced in the heads, hands, arms, and breast. They filled the vault of the world like flying clouds, obscuring the sun, and the sides of heaven, and the surface and heights of the earth. The earth was battered and rent to pieces by fragments of broken weapons falling from the waist of combatants, who assailed one another with their loud shouts. The sky echoed to the thunderclaps of weapons striking each other, the clattering of the stones and trees, and the blows of the warriors on one another, as if it was the commotion of the day of universal destruction. The disordered world seemed to approach its untimely end from the blowing of furious winds, mixed with fire and water, and the many suns of the gods and demons shining above and below. All quarters of heaven seemed to be crying aloud with the sound of hurling weapons, rolling as mountain peaks, roaring as lions, and borne by the blowing winds on all sides. The sky appeared as an ocean of illusion, burning with the bodies of warriors like flaming trees, and rolling in surges of gods and demon dead bodies floating on it like mountains. The edges of the earth seemed like forests made by the clubs, lances, spears, and many other weapons constantly falling upon them. The horizon was surrounded by the big and impenetrable line of demonic bodies resembling the chain of Mount Samuro encircling the earth. The earth itself resembled an ocean filled with the mountainous bodies of fallen warriors and towers of celestial cities blown down by the wind. The sky was filled with violent sounds, and the earth and its mountain were washed by torrents of blood. Blood-sucking demons danced on all sides and filled the cavity of the world with confusion. The dreadful warfare between gods and demons resembled a tumult that raged through the endless space of the world, that rise and fall with the alternations of pleasure and pain to which it is constantly subject. Chapter 29. Defeat of the Demons. Vasistha continued, "In this manner the energetic and murderous demons repeated their attacks and waged many wars with the gods. They carried on their warfare sometimes by fraud and oftentimes by their aggressiveness, and frequently after a truce of open war was made with the gods. They sometimes fled, renewed their strength, and attacked again in the open field. Other times they lay in ambush, concealed in their underground caves. Thus they waged their battle against the celestials for 35 years, by repeatedly flying and withdrawing from the field. Then reappearing with their arms, they fought again for 5 years, 8 months and 10 days, shooting their firearms, trees, and stones, and thunders upon the god. Being used to warfare for such a long period, at last they grew proud of their superior strength, and repeated successes and entertained the desire of their final victory. Their constant practice in arms made them sure of their success, just as the nearness of objects casts their reflection in the mirror. But as distant objects are never reflected in the glass, so the desire for anything is never successful without intense application to it. So when the desires of the demons Dhamma and others became identified with their selves, their souls degraded from their greatness and became confined to their belief of the desired objects. All worldly desires lead to false expectation, and those entangled in the snares of their expectations are thereby reduced to meanness in their spirit. Falling into the errors of egoism and selfishness, the demons were led into the blunder of me-ism, thinking these things as mine, just as man mistakes a rope for a snake. Being reduced to the depravity of selfishness, they began to think their personalities consisted in their bodies. They began to reflect how their bodies could be safe and secure from harm from head to foot. They lost their patience by continually thinking about protecting their bodies, their properties, and their pleasure of life. Desire of their enjoyment diminished their strength and valor. Their former acts of gallantry now became a dead letter to them. They thought only how to become lords of the earth, and thus became lazy and weak like lotus flowers without water. Their pride and egoism led their inclination towards the pleasure of good eating and drinking, and to the possession of every worldly good. They began to hesitate to join in warfare, and became as timid deer, afraid to encounter furious elephants ravaging the forest. They moved slowly in despair of their victory and for fear of losing their lives in their encounter with the gods' furious elephants in the field. These cowards, wishing to preserve their bodies from the hands of death, became so powerless that they rested satisfied with their enemies' feet on their heads. Thus those unnerved demons were as unable to kill the enemy standing before them, as a fire without enough fuel is unable to consume the sacred ghee offering. They become like gnats before the aggressive gods, standing with their bruised bodies like beaten soldiers. What more needs to be said? The demons were overpowered by the gods and fled from battlefield in fear of their lives. When the demons Dhamma, Bala, and Kala and others were repulsed by the prowess of the gods and fled cowardly in different ways, the remaining demons fell down before the gods and fled from the air on all sides, like the falling stars of heaven at the end of a Kalpa age. They fell upon the summits of mountains and in the trees of the Sumera range. Some were wrapped in the folds of the clouds above, and others fell on the banks of distant seas below. Many fell in the cavities of the eddies of the seas, and in the abyss of the ocean, and in the running streams. Some fell into far distant forests, and others dropped down amidst the burning woods of wildfires. Some, being pierced by the arrows of the celestials, fell in distant countries, villages, and cities on earth. Others were hurled in thick jungles of wild beasts, and in sandy deserts and wildfires. Many fell in the polar regions, some landing on the mountain tops, and others sinking in the lakes below. Several were tossed over the countries of Andhra, Dravida, Kashmir, and Persia. Some sank in billowy seas and in the watery maze of the Ganges, and others fell on distant islands in different parts of Asia and in the nets of fishermen. Thus the enemies of the gods lay everywhere with their mountainous bodies, all full of scars from head to foot and mutilated in hands and arms. Some were hanging by their outstretched entrails on tree branches, gushing out with blood. Others were cropped off crowns, and heads were lying on the ground with open and fiery eyes. Many were lying with their broken armor and weapons, slashed by the superior power of the enemy, their robes and garments all dismantled and torn by their fall. Their helmets, which were terrific by their blaze, were hanging down their necks. The braids of their hair, woven with stones, hung loosely about their bodies. The heads, covered with hard brazen and pointed crowns, were broken by stone slabs hurled upon them from the hands of the god. In this manner, at the end of the battle, the demons together with all their weapons were destroyed on all sides. They were devoured like seawater dissolves dust. Chapter 30. The Subsequent Lives of Dhamma, Bala, and Kala. Vasistha continued, Upon destruction of the demons, the gods were exceedingly joyous, but Dhamma and the other demon leaders became immersed in sorrow and grief. Sambara was full of wrath, and his anger was ignited like an all-destroying fire against his generals, whom he called aloud by their names and said, "Where are they?" But they had fled from their abodes for fear of his anger. Dhamma, Bala, and Kala hid themselves in the seventh sphere of the infernal regions. There dwelt the horrid instruments of death, formidable as their lord Yama himself, and who were glad with their duty of guarding the abyss of hell. The fearless guards of hell received them in their favor, and having given them shelter in the hell pit, gave them their 3 maiden daughters in marriage. In their company they passed a period of 10,000 years, and gave a free vent to their evil desires up to the ends of their life. Their time passed away in such thoughts as these, that this is my consort, and this is my daughter, and I am their lord. They were bound together with ties of mutual affection as strong as a chain of death. It happened on one occasion that Yama, the god of retributive justice, came by to survey the state of affairs in that sad, mournful pit of hell. The 3 demons, being unaware of Yama's rank and dignity, failed to make their obeisance to the Lord of Hell, and at their peril took him to be one of Yama's servants. Then a nod of Yama's eyebrows assigned them a place in the burning furnace of hell, where they were immediately cast by the stern porters of Hell's Gate. There they lay burning with their wives and children, and they were consumed to death like a straw hut and withered trees. The evil desires and wicked propensities that they contracted in the company of the hellish crowd caused their reincarnation in the forms of karatas to carry on their slaughter and atrocities like Yama's thralls. Getting rid of that birth, they were next born as ravens, and then as vultures and falcons of mountain caves. Then they were transformed into the forms of hogs in the land of Trigarta, and then as mountain rams in Magadha, and afterwards as heinous reptiles in caves and holes. Then, after passing successively into a variety of other forms, they are now lying as fish in the woodland lake of Kashmir. Being burnt in hellfire at first, they now have their temporary rest in the water of the lake and drink its filthy water, whereby they neither die nor live to their heart's content. Having thus passed over and over into various births, and having been transformed again and again to be reborn on earth, they are rolling like waves of sea to all eternity. Thus, like their endless desires, they have been eternally rolling like weeds in the ocean of the earth. There is no end to their pain until the end of their desires. Chapter 31. Reality is within God. There is no reality without. Vasistha continued, "It was for your enlightenment, O high-minded Rama, that I have told you the story of Dhamma, Bala, and Kala, so that you may derive instruction thereby, and not let it go for nothing as a mere idle story. Slighting the truth and following untruth incur endless miseries, of which the careless pursuer of untruth is scarcely aware. See how great was the leadership of Sambara's army, and how they defeated the host of the immortal gods. Reflect on the change of their state to contemplate a fish in a dry and dirty quagmire. See their former strength, which put legions of immortals to flight, and to think on their later base servitude as hunters under the chief of Karatas. See at first their unselfishness of mind and great patience, then at last their vain desires and assumption of the vanity of egotism. In the forest of the world, selfish ego is the root of the extended branches of misery that produces and bears the poisonous blossom of desire. Therefore, O Rama, be diligent to wipe the sense of your ego from your heart. Try to be happy by always thinking. This I is nothing. The error of egoism hides the bright moon of truth like a dark cloud and causes the cooling moonbeams to disappear from sight. The 3 demons, Dhamma, Bala, and Kala, being under the demonic influence of ego, and by the excess of their illusion, believe their non-entity to be a positive entity. They are now living as fish in a muddy pool of a lake among the forest lands of Kashmir. Presently they are content feeding with zest upon the moss and weeds growing in it. Rama said, "Tell me, sage, how did they come to existence when they were non-existent before? For neither can a nothing be an existent being, nor an entity become a non-entity at any time." Vasistha replied, "So it is, O strong-armed Rama, that nothing can ever be something, and anything can never be nothing. But it is possible for a little thing to be great, and for a great one to be reduced to minuteness. Tell me, what non-entity has come to being, or what entity has been lasting forever? All these I will explain to you by the best proof and example." Rama answered, "Why, sage, all that is existent is ever present before us, as our own bodies, and all things beside ourselves. But you said Dhamma and the other demons were unreal, produced by the magic of Sambara. How could they become real?" Vasistha speaking, "Yes, Rama, the non-existent and unreal Dhamma and others seem to exist by mere illusion, like a mirage appears to be full of water by optical illusion. It is in the same manner that we, these gods and demigods, and everything else are unrealities in fact, and yet we seem to turn about and speak and act like real persons. My existence is as unreal as yours, yet it appears as real as our dream of death and sleep. As the sight of a dead friend in a dream is not real, so the notion of the reality of the world ceases upon the conviction of its unreality, just as that of the death of the person seen in a dream. But such assertion of our non-existence are unacceptable to those deluded into the belief of the reality of the objects of the senses. It is the habit of thinking its reality that will not listen to its contradiction. This mistaken impression of the reality of the world cannot be effaced without the knowledge of its unreality derived from the Scripture and the certainty of thinking it so. He who preaches the unreality of the world and the reality of Brahman is derided by the ignorant as a madman. The learned and the ignorant cannot agree on the subject, just as drunken and sober men cannot reach an understanding. One who has a distinct knowledge of light and darkness knows the difference between shade and sunlight. It is impossible to turn the ignorant from their belief in the reality of unrealities to truth, just as it is impossible to make a corpse stand on its leg and walk. It is in vain to preach the doctrine of that Brahman is all to the vulgar, who do not know pure meditation and remain devoted to their ideas that things which can be sensed are real. The learned, who know themselves to be Brahman, know that it is useless to lecture the ignorant on this subject. The intelligent man who believes that the supremely quiet spirit of Brahman pervades the whole universe cannot be distracted by anyone from his firm belief. Nothing can shake the faith of the man who knows himself as nothing but the supreme being who is all in all, and who thinks himself to be dependent on the substantiality of God, just as the form of a ring depends on its substance of gold. The ignorant have no notion of the spirit, only matter which they believe to be the cause and effect of its own production. A learned man sees the substantive spirit in all forms of creation, just like he sees the substance of gold in all the ornaments made of that metal. An ignorant man is composed only of his ego, and a sage is filled with only his spirituality. Neither is ever thwarted from his own belief. What is one's nature or habit of thinking can hardly be altered, for it would be foolish for one habituated to think himself as a man to take himself for a pot or otherwise. Therefore, though we and others, and the Dhamma and the other demons are nothing in reality, yet who can believe that we or these or those are not ourselves? There is but one being that is really existent, who is truth and consciousness himself, and of a nature of emptiness and pure understanding. He is immaculate, all-pervading, quiescent, and without rise or fall. Being perfect, silence, and void, he seems as nothing existent, yet all these creations exist in that emptiness as particles of his own splendor. As the stars are seen to shine resplendent in the darkness of night, and as worms and waves are seen to float on the surface of the waters, so do all these phenomena appear to occur in his reality. Whatever that being purposes himself to be, he immediately conceives himself to be the same. It is only the empty consciousness which is the true reality. All others are also real when viewed in and rising and setting in out of its own will. Therefore, there is nothing real or unreal in the three worlds. It is all or in the same form as it is viewed by consciousness. It all arises before consciousness of its own spontaneity. We also have sprung from that divine will, like Dhamma and others. Therefore, there is no reality or unreality in any of us, except at that time when we exist or cease to do so. This infinite and formless void of consciousness is omnipresent and all-pervading. In whatever form this consciousness manifests itself in any place, it appears there in the same figure and manner. As divine consciousness expanded itself with the image of Dhamma and others, it immediately assumed those shapes by its notion of the same. So it is with every one of us, that all things are produced to our view according to our notions presented to our consciousness. What we call the world is the representation of things to us as in our dreams. It is a hollow body like a bubble rising in the empty ocean of consciousness and appearing as the water in a mirage. The waking state of the empty intellect is called the phenomenal world, and its state of sleep and rest is what we call liberation, emancipation, or salvation from pain. But consciousness, which never sleeps, nor has to be awakened at any time, is the emptiness of the divine mind, in which the world is ever present in its visible form. There the work of creation is united with the rest of nirvana, and the cessation of the act of creation is joined with uninterrupted quiet. Yet no difference whatever exists in God between alternating work and rest at any time. The divine intellect views its own form in the world, and it views the world in itself in its true sense, like a blinded eye sees the inner light in its orbit. The divine intellect, like the blinded eye, sees nothing outside, but views every form within itself. This is because there is no visible or phenomenal world other than that is within the empty sphere of the intellect. There are all these things everywhere as we have ideas of them in our minds, but there is never anything anywhere if we have no previous idea of it in the mind. It is the one quiet Spirit of God which lies extended in all these forms coming to our knowledge. Therefore, knowing Him as all in all gives up all your fears and sorrows and duality. Rest in peace in His unity. The great intellect of God is as solid and clear as a block of crystal, which is both dense and transparent in the inside. They appear to be all hollow within, but replete with the images of all things from without. Chapter 32. Dhamma, Bala, and Kala obtain liberation on good conduct. Rama said, "Tell me, sage, how did Dhamma, Bala, and Kala finally obtain their liberation, like all other virtuous souls, and become released from the torment of hell, like children getting rid of the fear of Yaksha demons and Pashaka ghosts?" Vasistha replied, "Hear, O support of Raghu's rays, what Yama said about Dhamma, Bala, and their companions when they asked for their liberation throughout his attendance in hell. Yama said that Dhamma and others would obtain their liberation upon death releasing them from their demonic bodies, and upon hearing the account of their lives and actions. Rama said, "Tell me, sage, how and when and from what source did Dhamma and others come to learn the account of their lives, and how they obtained their release from hell?" Vasistha replied, "These demons, transformed into fish in a pool by the bank of the great lotus lake in Kashmir, underwent many miserable births in their fish-like forms in that same pond. In that marshy ground they were crushed to death under the feet of buffaloes. Then they were transformed into the shape of cranes frequenting that lake of lotuses. They fed upon moss and mushrooms and tender petals of lotuses. They had to live upon the leaves of aquatic plants and vines that floated on the surface of the waves. They swung in cradles of flowers, rested on beds of blue lotuses, dived in the vortices of the waters, and flew under the cooling showers of rainy clouds. At last these charming cranes and herons were cleansed of their brutish foulness by their vegetable food of sweet fruits and flowers, and by their pure beverage of the crystal lake, the food of holy saints. Having by these means obtained a clear understanding, they were prepared for their release from their brutish states. Like men who become able to distinguish and get hold of the good and virtuous qualities of sattva, purity, balance, and raja, activity, from the evil of tamas, passivity, are entitled to their liberation. Now in the happy valley of Kashmir there is a city by the name of Vasistha, which is surrounded on all sides by mountains and trees. It is very romantic in appearance. In the middle of that city there is a hill known as Pradyuma Sakhara. It resembles a pistil rising from the center of a lotus flower. On the top of that hill there is a building towering over all other buildings, and piercing the sky with its high turrets that appear like pinnacles above its summit. On the northeast corner of that building there is a hollow at the top of its towering turret. It is overgrown with moss and continually resounds to the blowing wind. There the demon Balya, in the form of a sparrow, built his nest and chirped his meaningless notes, like one who repeats Vedic hymns without knowing their meaning. At that time there was a king in that city named Yasakara, or the Renowned, who reigned there like Indra over the gods in heaven. The demon Dhamma became a gnat and dwelt in that building and continued to buzz his low tone in the crevice of the lofty column. It came to pass that the citizens of Vasistha prepared a playground named Ratvanati Vihara in that city. There resided the king's minister, Narashima by name. He understood the fates of humankind, just as the astronomer knows the stars of heaven on a small celestial globe which he holds in his hand. It also happened at the time that the deceitful demon Kala was as reborn as a parrot and became the minister's favorite, kept in a silver cage in his house. It then turned out that the minister recited the poetic story of the war between demons and gods to the resident of the palace. The parrot Kara happened to hear it. He remembered his past life, whereby he was absolved of his sins and attained his final liberation. The sparrow, living on top of Pradyumana Hill, also chanced to hear the story of his life in that palace, and he obtained his liberation thereby. Dhamma, who lived in the palace in the form of a gnat, also happened to hear the minister recital of his tale, and thereby obtained his peace and release. In this manner, O Rama, the sparrow of Pradyumana Hill, the gnat in the palace, and the parrot in the playground, all had their liberation. Thus I have told you the whole story of the demon Dhamma and the others, which should fully convince you of the vanity of the world. Only the ignorant are tempted to vanity by their error, just like those led to the illusion of water in a mirage. Even the great are liable, like these demons, to fall low by their error. Think how one of those demons who had reduced the high Mero and Mandara mountains with a nod of his eyebrows was constrained to remain as a contemptible gnat in the crack of a pillar in the palace. Look at the other who threatened to destroy the sun and moon with a slap, living at last with a poor sparrow on the hole of the peak of a Pradyumana hill. Look at the third who balanced Mount Meru like a flower bouquet in his hand, lying imprisoned as a parrot in a cage at the house of Narasimha. When the sphere of pure consciousness is colored with ego, it is debased into another form and another birth without changing its nature. A man's wrong desire makes him take the untruth for truth, just like a person's excessive thirst makes him mistake a mirage for water, and thereby he loses both his way and his life. Only those men can cross the ocean of the world who by the natural bent of their good understanding are inclined to study Scripture and look forward to their liberation by rejecting whatever is vicious and untrue. Those prone to false reasoning and heresy by rejecting revelations are subject to various changes and miseries. They lose the best of life and fall like running water into a pit. But those who walk by the dictates of conscience and follow the path pointed by the Vedas are saved from destruction and attain their best state. O high-minded Rama, he whose greed makes his mind always long after having this thing and that thing, loses the highest goal of his being. Parama Purushottra, leaving not even ashes or any other trace behind. The high-minded man regards the world like straw and shuns all its concerns like a snake casting off its skin. He whose mind is illumined by the wonderful light of truth is always taken under the protection of the gods, just as the cosmic egg is protected by Brahma. Nobody should walk in paths that are long and wearisome, crooked and winding, and surrounded by danger and difficulties. Rahu, the ascending node of the moon, lost its life by its curved course in to drink the nectarine beams of the moon. He who abides by the dictates of the true Scriptures and associates with the best of men is never subject to the darkness of error. Those renowned for their virtues have the power to bring their destiny under their command, convert all their evils to good, and render their prosperity perpetual. Those who are unsatisfied with their qualifications, and those who thirst after knowledge and are seekers of truth, are truly called human beings. All others are only brutes. Those whose hearts are like lakes brightened by the moonbeams of fame have the form of Vishnu seated in their hearts, just as in the sea of milk. Repeatedly desiring enjoyment of what has been enjoyed and seeing what has often been seen is not the way to get rid of the world. It is the cause of repeated birth for the same enjoyment and sights. Continue to abide by the established rule of conduct, act according to the Scriptures and good custom, and break off the bonds of worldly enjoyment, which are all only vanities. Let the world resound with the renown of your virtues reaching to the skies, because your fame and not the enjoyment you have enjoyed will immortalize your name. Those whose good deeds shine like moonbeams and are sung by the maidens of heaven are said to be truly living. All others, unknown to fame, are really dead. Those who aspire to their utmost perfection by their unfailing effort and acting according to the precepts of the Scriptures are surely successful in their attempt. Patiently adhering to the Scripture without hastening for the success and perfecting oneself by long practice produce the ripe fruits of consummation. Now, Rama, renounce all your sorrow and fear, your anxieties, pride, and hastiness. Conduct yourself according to the law and Scriptures and immortalize your name. Take care what your sensuous soul does not perish like prey in the snare of your sensual appetites, or like a blind old man falling into the hidden pits of this world. Do not allow yourself to be degraded below the vulgar, but consider well the Scripture as the best weapons to defeat the danger and difficulty of the world. Why endanger your life in the muddy pit of this world, like an elephant falling in a pit under the keen arrows of the enemy? Avoid and only taste its enjoyment, and you are free from all danger. Of what use is wealth without knowledge? Therefore devote yourself to learning, and consider your riches to be only trash and bubbles. Knowledge of heretical Scriptures has made beasts of men, making them miserable and unhappy by their unprofitable argument. Now wake and shake off the dullness of your long, deep, and death-like sleep, like the torpor of an old tortoise lying in a bog. Rise and accept an antidote to ward off your old age and death. This prescription is knowledge that all wealth and property are for our evil, and all pleasure and enjoyment tend only to sicken and weaken our bodies. No difficulty to be your prosperity, and your detachment from the world to be your great gain. Conduct yourself according to the meaning of the Scriptures, as they are supported by good custom. Acts done according to the Scriptures and good customs produce the best fruit, that of immortality. He who acts well according to good customs, who considers everything by good reason, and who is indifferent to the pain and pleasure of the world, flourishes like a tree in spring, with the flowers and fruits of long life and fame, virtues and good quality and prosperity. Chapter 33. Effort Attains, Ego and its Three Forms. Vasistha continued, knowing that the complete success of every undertaking depends on your own effort at all times and places, you should never be slack in your efforts. See how Nandi gratified the wishes of all his friends and relations by his own exertion, and how he became victorious over death itself by his adoration of Mahadeva Shiva by the side of the lake. See also how the Danava demigods, by their greater wealth and prowess, got the better of the gods who were filled with every perfection, just like elephants destroy a lake of lotuses. See how Maruta, the king of the demons, by means of his sacrifice through the great sage Samvarta, the lawgiver, created another world like that of Brahma. See how Vishwamitra, the general, obtained the dignity of being one with Brahman by his great energy and continued effort. By his austerities he obtained what is impossible for another. See how in days of yore the poor and unfortunate Upamanyu obtained his nectar-like food of cake and curdled milk from the milky ocean by worshipping Shiva. See how the god Vishnu devoured the demons of the triple world like a wildfire destroys the tender filaments of lotuses, and how the sage Sweta became victorious over death by means of his firm faith in Shiva. Remember how the caste Savitra bought back her spouse Satyavana from the realm of death by prevailing on stern Yama with the sweet politeness of her discourse. There is no great effort of any kind that goes unrewarded in this world. All impossibility is possible by ardent pursuit. So men have full knowledge of the spirit, and exerting their utmost devotion, are able to root out their destiny of reincarnation that is filled with so much pain and pleasure. All visible things are full of danger in the sight of the intelligent. There is no pleasure to be had from anything without its accompanying pain. Though it is difficult to know the supreme Brahma and easy to attain supreme joy, yet Brahma should be sought at first as the giver of all joy. Forsake your pride and rely on your unalterable peace of mind. Consider well your worthiness in your understanding, and remain attentive to the wise and good. In this ocean of the world there is no way for your salvation except by your attendance on the wise. All your pilgrimage, austerities, and learning of the Scripture of no avail to your liberation. He is called wise whose greediness, anger, and false conceptions decline day by day, and who walks in the path of righteousness as taught in the Scriptures. The company of spiritual guides serves to dispel phenomena from the sight of the devout, like invisible, hidden from sight. In the absence of the object of perception, only the Supreme Spirit remains in view, and the human soul have nothing else to rest upon, rest at last only in the Supreme Soul. Phenomena did not exist before, nor are they produced from nothing. They are not in existence, though we see them in our presence, nor will they exist in the future. The Supreme alone exists forever without change or decay. I have already shown you by various examples the falsehood of phenomena. Now I will show you the falsity of existence as it is known to the learned. Now that we have our passive consciousness of the three worlds, this being the sober truth of the wise, there can be no room for the unrealities of matter and illusion to enter into our belief. The world is whatever wonders are displayed by the act of consciousness to the inactive soul. The notion of the world is derived from the rays of the central intellect stretching to the circumference of understanding. There being no difference between the radiating point and the radiated circle, we acknowledge the identity of the radiator, the radius, and the circle. The opening and shutting of intellectual eye causes the notion and the appearance and disappearance of the world in continued succession. One unacquainted with the true sense of ego is blind within the luminous sphere of consciousness, but he who knows its true meaning finds himself within the sphere of spiritual light and loses himself in the divine light. He who understands divine ego no longer retains any notion of his own ego, but mixes with the Supreme Soul, like a drop of water lost in the water of the ocean. In reality, there exists no I or you, or any visible world or anything else. Upon right reasoning, all these blend into the one ego which remains and exists after all other existences. Even clear understanding are sometimes clouded by false appearances, like children seized with false fear of demons or ogres. As long as the moonlight of consciousness remains hidden by the darkness of individual ego, the lotus lake of spirituality will not bloom. The feeling of ego being wiped from the mind, the sense of self and selfish passions will vanish of themselves from the heart, and there will be an utter end to fears of death and hell, as also to desires of heaven and liberation. As long as ego feelings float like clouds over the mind, there will be no end of desire growing in the heart like weeds in the plain. As long as the clouds of ego continues to overcast the mind and obscure its consciousness, the humidity of dullness will fill its sphere and prevent the light of consciousness from piercing through it. Ego pride is unmannerly in men. It is taken in the light of vanity. It is the cause of sorrow and not delight. It is like imaginary ghosts to children. The vain assumption of egoism produces a great many errors. It leads to the ambition of gaining an infinity of worlds, as it was in the case of foolish demons. There is no error greater than the conceit that I am such and such a great man. There will never be a greater error to lead us to utter darkness. Whatever joy or grief falls upon us at any time in this changing world, it is all the effect of the rotating wheels of ego turning up and down at every moment. He who weeds and roots out the germs of ego from his heart truly prevents the tree of worldliness from growing out in 100 branches. Belief in the individual ego is the sprout of the trees of our lives in their endless cycles through the world. The sense that this is mine is the cause that makes ego expand into 1,000 branches. Our desires and the objects of our desires disappear as swiftly as birds in flight. Upon mature consideration, they prove to be only bubbles bursting on the fleeting, impermanent waves of our lives. It is because we have no knowledge of the one ego that we think ourselves as I, you, this, or the other. It is by shutting out our view of the only soul that we see the constant revolution of this world and that. As long as the darkness of egoism reigns over the wilderness of human life, the goblin of selfishness infests it with its wanton revelry. The vile man, seized by the avaricious demon of selfishness, is at an utter loss to satisfy his needs with any moral precepts or spiritual mantra. Rama said, "Tell me, O venerable Brahmin, how can we suppress our egoism or selfishness and evade the danger and difficulty in our course through the world?" Vasistha replied, "It is by seeking to settle the mind in a resplendent soul that shines in a transparent mirror of consciousness. In this way it is possible for anyone to suppress his sense of personal existence. A close investigation into human life proves it to be a maze full with the false shows of magic. It is not worth loving or hating, and is not capable of causing our ego pride. He whose soul is free from selfishness, who is devoid of the impression of phenomena, whose course of life runs in an even course, is a man who can have no sense of ego in him. He who knows his inner self to be beyond the external world, and who neither desires nor dislikes anything in the world, and who preserves the serenity of his temper at all times, is not susceptible of egoism. Whoever thinks himself to be the inner ideal, distinct from outer phenomena, and keeps the calm equanimity of his mind, is not ruffled by the feeling of his egoism." Rama said, "Tell me, sage, what is the form of ego? Does it exist in the body or mind or both? Is it eliminated when the body dies?" Vasistha replied, "Rama, in this triple world there are 3 sorts of egoism. 2 are of superior nature, but the third is of a vile kind, and it is to be abandoned by all. The first is the supreme and undivided ego that is diffused through the world. It is the supreme soul, Paramatman, besides which there is nothing in nature. The feeling of this kind of egoism leads to the liberation of man, as in the state of the living liberated. The next form of self-consciousness is the knowledge of ego as distinct and apart from all, and as minute as the 100th part of a hair. This ego is good also. The second form of ego also leads to the liberation of human souls, even in a state known as living liberation. The last and worst kind of ego is identification with the body and all its parts. This ego takes the body to be the soul or self. This third and last kind is the popular belief of mankind, who take their bodies as part of themselves. It is the basest form of ego, and must be forsaken in the same manner as we shun our inveterate enemies. The man debased by this kind of ego can never come to his right sense. Under the thrall of this powerful enemy, a man remains subject to all the evils of life. Possessed with this wrong notion of himself, every man is constantly troubled by various desires in his mind, and these expose him to all the evils of life. By means of the better sense of ego, man transforms themselves into gods, but the common form of ego debases the man to the state of a beast and its attendant evils. That "I am not the body" is a certainty arrived at by the great and good, who, believing themselves to be the first 2 kinds of ego, are superior to the vulgar. Belief in the first 2 kinds raises men above the common level, but the ego of a lower kind brings every misery on mankind. It was owing to their baser sense of ego that the demons Bama, Bala, and others were reduced to their deplorable state, as was related in that story. Rama said, "Sage, describe to me the state of a man who has discarded the third or popular kind of ego from his mind, a man who attains the well-being of his soul in both the present and future worlds." Vasistha replied, "Having cast off this poisonous ego, a man rests in the Supreme Spirit in the same manner as the believer in the 2 other sorts of ego. The first 2 views of ego place the egotist in the ego of divine unity, but all these views of ego in reality are only different forms of dualism. When lost in the unity, all consciousness of distinct personality is absorbed in the Supreme One. Good understanding should always strive to its utmost to get rid of its common and gross sense of ego, identifying with the body in order to feel itself the indescribable joy of the unity. The greatest good that one can attain for this highest state of joy, Parama Padam, is to renounce the unholy belief in one's separate personality in his material body. The man who gives up his identity as a personal ego in his body is not debased or lost either by his indifference to or by his management of worldly affairs. The man who has rid his mind of ego by reducing his selfishness is indifferent to pain and pleasure, just as the satisfied are to the taste of sweet and sour. The man detesting the pleasure of life has his full bliss presented before him. The mind is cleared of its doubt, and darkness has nothing hidden from its sight. By investigation into the nature of the ego, and forsaking his gross selfishness, a man crosses over the ocean of the world of his own accord. The man who is nothing of his own, who knows himself as nothing, and yet who is all and thinks himself as all in all, and who, though possessed of wealth and properties, has the generosity of his soul to disown them to himself, he truly is situated in the Supreme Soul, and finds his rest in a state of supreme bliss. Chapter 34. End of the story of Dhamma, Bala, and Kala, Bhima, Basa, Drijya. Vasistha continued, Now hear me describe what Samvara did after the flight of Dhamma and his army, and how he remained in his rocky stronghold in the region of hell. After the complete overthrow of Samvara's entire army and their downfall from heaven, like innumerable raindrops falling from a great cloud, and after dispersing itself and disappearing in autumn, Samvara remained motionless for many years in a strong citadel. Numbed by the loss of his forces defeated by the gods, he wondered about the best means of overcoming the gods. He thought, the demons Dhamma and others that I produce by my black arts are all defeated in battle by their foolishness and vanity of pride and ego. Now I will produce some other demons by the power of my charm, and endue them both with the power of reason and acquaintance with spiritual science, so that they may know and judge for themselves. These, being acquainted with the true nature of things and devoid of false views, will not be subject to pride or vanity, but will be able to defeat the gods in battle. Thinking in this way to himself, the arch-fiend produced a host of good demons by his skill in sorcery. The creatures of his spell filled the space of the sky like bubbles foam and float on the surface of the sea. They were all knowing and acquainted with what could be known. They were all dispassionate and sinless and solely intent on their allotted duties, which composed minds and good dispositions. They were known under the names of Bhima, Basha, Drijya, and by the holiness of their hearts they looked upon all earthly things as mere straw. These infernal spirits burst out of the ether and sprang up to the upper world, then spread over the face of the sky like a swarm of locusts. They cracked like guns and roared and rolled about like clouds of the rainy season. They fought with the gods for many cycles of years, yet they were not elated with pride owing to their being under the guidance of reason and judgment. No one could defeat them because they had no desire of having anything and no thought that this is my own. They had no identity as a personal existence such as this is me and that one is another. They were fearless fighting the gods because they knew that they were as mortal as themselves, and because they lacked any knowledge of any difference between one another. They attacked with a firm conviction that the unsubstantial body is nothing, the intellect is lodged in the pure soul, and that there is nothing which we call I or another. These demons were devoid of the sense of themselves or their fears. They necessarily had no fear of death. They were employed in their present duties without thoughts of past or future. Their minds were attached to nothing. They slew their enemies without thinking themselves as their slayers. They did their duties and thought themselves as no doers of them. They were utterly free from all desire. They waged war under the sense of doing their duty to the master, while their own nature was entirely free from all passion and affection, always remaining at even tenor. The infernal force under the command of Bhima, Basha, and Drijya bruised and burned and slew and devoured the celestial phalanx, as men knead and fry and boil rice and afterward eat it up as their food. The celestial army, harassed on all sides by Bhima, Basha, and Drijya, fled precipitously from the heights of heaven, as the Ganges runs down from the Himalayan heights. The defeated legion of the gods then resorted to God Vishnu, sleeping on the surface of the ocean of milk, just as the clouds of heaven are driven by winds to the top of the mountain. The god Vishnu, lying as Narayana, folded in the coils of a serpent like a consort in the arms of his mistress, gave the gods their hope of future final success. The gods hid themselves in that ocean until it pleased Lord Vishnu to proceed out to destroy the demons. Then there was a dreadful war between Vishnu and Samvara, which broke and bore away the mountains as in an untimely great deluge on the earth. The mighty demon, finally overthrown by the might of Narayana, was sent to and settled in the city of Vishnu after his death. The demons Bhima, Basha, and Drijya were also killed in their unequal struggle with Vishnu, and were extinguished like lamps by the wind. They became extinct like flames of fire, and it was not known where their vital flame fled. It is a desire of a person that leads him to another state, but these, having no wish in them, had no other place to go. Hence the soul without wish is liberated, but not the mind full of yearning desire. Therefore, O Rama, use your reason to have a mind and soul without wishes. A full investigation into truth will immediately put down your desires, and the extinction of desires will restore your mind to rest like an extinguished candle. Complete wisdom consists in the knowledge of there being nothing real in the world, that our knowledge of reality is utterly false, and that nothingness is the true reality. The whole world is full with the Spirit of God, whatever otherwise one may think of it at any time. There can be no other thought of it except that it is a nothingness, and this forms our perfect knowledge of it. The two significant words, will and mind, are mere insignificant fictions, like the head and trunk of an ascending and descending nodes of a planet, which upon their right understanding are lost in the Supreme Spirit. The mind accompanied by its desires is confined in this world, but when the mind is released from desire, it is said to have its liberation. The mind gains its existence in the belief of men because of the many ideas of pots and pictures and other things that are imprinted in it. But when these thoughts are repressed, the mind also vanishes of itself, like the phantoms of Yaksha demons. The demons Dhamma, Bala, and Kala were destroyed because they relied on their minds, but Bhima, Basha, and Dridya were saved by their beliefs in the Supreme Soul as pervading all things. Therefore, O Rama, reject the examples of the former and imitate those of the latter. Be not guided by the example of Dhamma, Bala, and Kala, is a lesson that was first delivered to me by Brahma, the lotus-born, and my progenitor himself. This lesson I repeat to you, O Rama, as my intelligent pupil, that you may never follow the example of the wicked demons Dham and others, but imitate the conduct of the good spirits Bhima and others in your conduct. It is constant pain and pleasure that forms the fearful feature of this world. There is no other way of evading its pangs and pains except by your apathetic behavior, which must be your crowning glory in this life. Chapter 35. Description of Detachment and Bliss. Vasistha continued, Blessed are the virtuous who have cleansed their hearts from the dirt of ignorance. Victorious are those heroes who have conquered their insatiable and uncontrollable minds. It is self-control, the management of one's own mind, that is the only means of wading through all troubles and distress amid all the dangers and difficulty of this world. Hear the summary of all knowledge, and retain and cultivate it constantly in your mind. The desire of enjoyment is our bondage in the world, and its abandonment is our release from it. What need is there of many teachings? Learn this one truth as the sum and substance of all. All pleasures are poisonous and destructive. You must fly from them as far from venomous snakes and a raging fire. Consider well and repeatedly that all that can be perceived by the senses are like hydras and dragons, and their enjoyment is gall and poison. Keep them at a distance and pursue your lasting good. The mind of desires produces destructive evils, like sterile ground is fertile only for thorns and brambles. The mind devoid of desire lacks its expansion, as the heart lacking its passion and affection is curbed and contracted into itself. The well-disposed mind always teems with virtues that are opposed to wrong acts and vice, just like fertile ground grows good and useful trees in spite of weeds and bushes. When the mind gains its serenity by culture of good qualities, the mist of its errors and ignorance gradually fade and fly away like clouds before the rising sun. Good qualities shining in the mind like stars in the moonlight sky give rise to the light of reason, like the bright sun of the day. As this practice of patience grows familiar in the mind, like medicinal Vamsa Lokana within bamboo, gives rise to the quality of firmness in the man, like the moon brightens the spring sky. Company of the good is a tree that gives its cooling shade of peace and yields the fruit of salvation. Its effect on righteous men is like of the stately Sarala tree, distilling the juice of spiritual joy from the fruit of samadhi. Thus prepared, the mind becomes devoid of its desire and enmity and is free from all trouble and anxiety. It becomes dull to the feeling of grief and joy, and also of pain and pleasure, and all its restlessness dies in itself. Its doubts about the truth of scriptures die away, just as a table of values and all its curiosities for novelties are put to stop. Its veil of myth and fiction is unveiled, and its ointment of error is rubbed out of it. The mind's attempts, efforts, malice, disdain, distress, and disease are all removed. The mist of its grief and sorrow and the chain of its affections are all blown and torn away. It discards the children of its doubts, repudiates the consorts of its greed, and breaks loose from the prison house of the body. It then seeks the welfare of the soul and attains its godly state of holiness. It abandons the cause of its stoutness and relinquishes its choice of this thing and that. Then, remembering the dignity of the soul, it casts off the covering of its body like straw. The elevation of the mind as worldly affairs tends to its destruction, and its depression in these leads to its spiritual elevation. The wise always lower their minds, or pride, but fools are more elevating. The mind makes the world its own and ranges all about it. The mind raises mountains and climbs over them. The mind is like an infinite vacuum. It comprehends all emptiness in itself, and it makes gods of friends and foes of others. When understanding is soiled by doubts and forgets the true nature of consciousness, and when it is full of all its worldly desires, then it takes upon the name mind. Consciousness perverted by its various desires is called the living soul or the animal soul, which is distinct from the rational soul. Understanding which forgets its intellect and falls into the error of its own personality is what we call the internal principle of the mind, which is all hollow within. The soul is not the man of the world, nor is it the body or its blood. All material bodies are only gross and dull matter, but the soul in the body is empty air and intangible. The body being dissected into atoms and analyzed in all its particles presents nothing but blood and entrails, just like the plantain tree, when cut into pieces, presents nothing but its folded rinds. Know that the mind and living soul make a man assume his mortal form. The mind takes its form by itself according to its own choice. Man stretches his own sphere of action by his own choice only to entrap himself in it, just as a silkworm weaves its cocoon for its own imprisonment. The soul lays down its air of being the body when it has to leave the body at some time or another. Then the soul assumes another form as a germ sprouts forth into leaves. As a desire or thought is in the mind, so is it born in its next state of transmigration. Hence the newborn babe is given to sleeping because it thinks itself to be still dead, lying in the night time of its own death. It is also given to the dreaming of those things which had been the objects of its desires or thought in its previous state of birth. So sour becomes sweet by mixture with sugar, and bitter seed produces sweet fruit by being sown with honey. So, on the contrary, sweet becomes bitter by mixing in gall and wormwood. Aiming after goodness and greatness makes a man good and great. One wishing to be an Indra, a lord of gods, dreams of his lordliness in his sleep. An inclination to meanness demeans a man, and a tendency to vileness maligns his conduct in life, just like one deluded by his imagination of devils comes to see their apparitions in his nightly vision. But what is naturally foul or fair can hardly turn otherwise at any time, as a still lake never becomes muddy and a dirty pool never becomes glassy. The perverted mind produces the fruits of its perversion in all its action, while pure-mindedness is filled with the effects of its purity everywhere. Good and great men never forsake their goodness and greatness, even in their fall and decline. So the glorious sun fills the vault of heaven with its glory, even when he is sinking below the horizon. There is no restriction or freedom of the human soul to or from any action or thing in this world. The soul is a mere passive and neutral consciousness of all that passes before it like a magic scene. The world is a magical city, like a mirage appearing to sight. It is of the nature of a delusive panorama that shows many moons of the one whose unity admits of no duality. So the one Brahman is represented as many by delusion. All this truly is the essence of Brahman, and this is the sober reality. The material world is insubstantial, and when seen truly appears as a hollow phantom. The ignorant person's misjudgment is that I am not the infinite, but am infinitesimal. But the certainty of my infinity and supremacy is the means for my absorption into the infinite and supreme. The belief of one's individuality as I am this, in his undivided, all-pervasive, and transparent soul, is the cause of bondage to his personality. It is a web spun by his false dualism. The supreme truth of true philosophy are the lack of knowledge of one's bondage or freedom, the knowledge of his unity or duality, and his belief in the totality of Brahman. The conditions for beholding Brahman in the soul are its perfect transparency amounting to its emptiness, and its lack of attachment to visible appearance, and also its indifference to all that is. There is no other way. The condition for receiving the sight of Brahma is the purity of the mind produced by acts of holiness, just like the whiteness of a cloth can receive any color upon it. O Rama, think that your soul is same with the souls of all other persons, and abstain from all other thoughts, whether what is desirable or undesirable, what invigorates or enfeebles the body, or what brings liberation after bondage or salvation after sinfulness. The mirror of the mind, cleansed by the knowledge of the Scripture, and made dispassionate through understanding, receives the reflection of Brahman like a clear crystal reflecting the image of things. Sight which is familiar with visible objects, and not with images and ideas in the mind, is called false vision of what is soon lost from view. When the mind is fixed upon God by extracting its sight from all mental vision, and what the eye sees, it is then the view of the Supreme before it. Visible sights which are obvious to view are all only unreal phantoms. It is the absorption of the mind in the divine that makes it identical with the divine and no other. We see something with our attention now, but it was not in our sight before or after we turn away. Therefore it must be considered absent in between before and after. Therefore, one unacquainted with his mind is as ignorant as a man who is unaware of what he holds in his own hand. One having no knowledge that the world is the same with the Supreme Spirit is always subject to misery, but the negation of any distinction between what can be perceived and God gives us both the pleasure of our enjoyment here and our liberation in future. It is ignorance to say that water is one thing and the wave is another, but it shows intelligence to say that they are one and the same thing. The vanities of the world are associated with sorrow. Therefore, discard all aspects of vanity. The abandonment of extravagance ultimately will lead to your attainment of wisdom. The mind composed of vain desires is an unreality in itself. Therefore, O Rama, why should you sorrow for something which in reality is nothing? O Rama, look upon all things as traps set to ensnare the soul, and regard them with an eye of apathy and unconcern, as an unkind kinsman looks upon his relatives. As the unkind relative is unconcerned with the joys and grief of his relations, so should you remain aloof from all things by knowing the falsehood of their nature. Rely on that eternal spirit which is infinite knowledge and joy, and which is between the viewer and the view. After the swiftness of the mind's flight is at an end, it will be fixed to the truth and adhere to it like clay. The airy flight of the mind being restrained, the sluggish body must cease to run about, and the dust cloud of ignorance will no more spread over the city of the world. When the rains of our desires are over and the calmness of the mind is restored, when the shuddering cold of dullness is fled, when the mud of worldliness is dried up, when the channel of our thirst is dried up, when drinking pots are sucked up and emptied, when the forest of the heart is cleared and its brambles are rooted out, and when the frost of false knowledge has disappeared, then the mist of error vanishes from view, like the shadow of night on the approach of dawn, and the cold of dullness is put to flight, like the poison of a snake bite by a potent charm of mantras. Then the streams of our desires do not run down the rock of our body, nor do the peacocks of our fleeting wishes fly and sport on its top. The sphere of our consciousness becomes as the clear sky, and the light of the living soul shines as brightly over the body like the midday sun. The cloud of error is dispelled and succeeded by the light of reason. The longing of the soul, purified of their impurities, make it shine brilliantly amidst its sphere. Then raptures of serene delight shoot forth in the soul like blooming blossoms in the open air, and a cool light is shed upon it, like the cooling beams of the autumn moon. This ecstasy of the soul unfolds all prosperity before it and fructifies with abundance the well-cultivated ground of the reasoning mind. It sheds its clear light all over the world and shows the depth of the hills and forests and everything on earth in their clearest light. This bliss expands the mind and makes it translucent. It makes the heart like a clear lake, blooming with blossoms of the lotus of truth, sattva, without the dust of ego activity, rajas. It is never infested by a swarming passion of the pride or idleness, tamas. The mind, cleansed of its selfishness, turns to universal benevolence and philanthropy. Being quite calm in itself, without any desire of its own, the mind reigns as lord over the city of its body. The man whose investigation has made him acquainted with all things, whose soul is enlightened with truth, whose mind is melted down from his pride, who is calm and quiet in his understanding, and who looks with pity at the unpleasant course of men's birth and death, he truly lives happily in the realm of his body without feverish anxiety about anything. Chapter 36, Description of the Intellect's Creation. Rama said, "Tell me, O Brahman, for the sake of my advancement in knowledge, how does the mundane system exist in the extra-mundane, immaterial soul?" Vasistha replied, "Worlds have no separate existence except in the Supreme Mind. They are all situated in divine consciousness like future waves exist in a calm sea. As the all-pervading sky cannot be seen owing to its extreme lack of substance, so the undivided nature of the all-pervasive consciousness cannot be perceived on account of its subtlety. As a gem has its own brilliance whether or not someone moves it, so the unreal world has its potential existence in the divine spirit, both in its states of action and inactivity. As clouds in the sky do not touch the sky or have a tangible feeling of the sky's emptiness, so the worlds existing in the receptacle of the intellectual soul have no contact with the extraneous intellect, which is unconnected with its content. As the light residing in the water of the sea or a pot of water is not connected either with the pot or the water, nor is it felt by us but by its reflection, so the intangible soul abides unconnected in its receptacle of the body and reflects itself only to our knowledge. Consciousness is devoid of every desire and designation. It is nameless and formless, but our intelligence gives names and forms to its reflection from some one of our intellectual ideas, such as the living soul and the like. Consciousness is clearer than translucent air, and finer than it by 100 times. It is known as an undivided whole by the learned who view it as identical with the whole undivided world, which consciousness comprehends within itself. As seawater shows itself in various forms in all its waves, so consciousness does not differ from various representations of its own motion that it shows to us. The diversities of our subjective and objective knowledge of myself and yourself, and these, are like the varieties of surging waves in the ocean of consciousness. These are false notions because they are only representation of the same element, the very same consciousness. The various states of consciousness, chit, exercise of consciousness, chinta, intelligence, chittam, and that which is intelligible, chetyas, all belong to the main principle of the soul. They are differently conceived by the learned and ignorant, but the difference is a mere conceit. Consciousness presents two different aspects to wise and unwise people. To the ignorant, it shows its unreal nature in the realistic conception of the world. To the learned, it exhibits its luminous form in the identity of all things with God. Consciousness, by its internal or intellectual light, enlightens the luminous bodies of the sun and stars. It gives a relish to things by its internal taste, and it gives birth to all beings from its inborn ideas of them. It neither rises nor sets, nor gets up or sits. It neither proceeds nor recedes back and forth. It is not here, nor is it nowhere. The pure and transparent consciousness which is situated in the soul displays in itself the phantasmagoria which is called the world. As a heap of fire emits its flame, a luminous body blazes with its ray. And as the sea swells and surges and breaks in with its inlets, so consciousness bursts out in its creation. Thus consciousness, which is self-manifest and omnipresent of its own nature, develops and envelops the world by its own manifestation and sight, and by its acts of integration and segregation, and its acts of accretion and secretion. By its own air and of its own accord, it is led to forget and forsake its state of infinity. By assuming its individual personality of ego, it is converted into an ignoramus. But its act of specialization, it falls from its knowledge of generals to that of particulars, and comes to make differences between positive and negative, and inclusion and exclusion. It strives and struggles within the confines of the sensuous body, and it multiplies in these bodies like weeds sprouting out of the bosom of the earth. It is consciousness that stretches the spacious vacuum to make room for the subsistence and growth of everything. Consciousness makes the all an ever-moving air and a liquid water for the vitality and nourishment of all. It makes the earth firm and the fire bright in the fixed worlds all around. It employs time by its injunction and prohibition. It gives fragrance to flowers, growing by degrees their filaments and pistils. It makes the moisture and porous ground to grow vegetables on earth. The rooted trees bear fruit from their juicy saps beneath, displaying their leaves with outlines in them like their veins and arteries. It renovates the forest with its gifts of various colors, and dyes them with a variety of colors from the rainbow of Indra. Consciousness bids the thin layers of rocks, fruits, and flowers to wait upon the flowery season of spring, then brings their fruits to perfection under the heat of the summer sun. It makes the dark blue clouds of heaven wait for the approach of rainy weather, and causes the harvest of fields to follow in the train of autumn. The cold season is decorated with its smiling frost, in its face of the 10 sides of the sky. Dewy weather is made to blow its icicles of dewdrops on the wings of winter's chilling wind. It makes ever-moving time revolve in its rotation of years and cycles and yuga ages, and it causes the tide of creation to roll on its waves of worlds on its bosom of the ocean of eternity. The decrees of consciousness remain fixed with a wonderful stability, and the earth continues firm with its quality of containing all things. It made the universal abound with 14 kinds of beings in as many worlds, the 14 planes of creation. These are as different in their modes of life as in their forms and figures. These are repeatedly produced from and reduced to nothing, and move in their accustomed courses forever, like bubbles in the waterless ocean of eternity. Here the miserable multitudes move madly in vain struggles after their desired objects, and in their imbecility under the subjection of disease and death. They are constantly coming to life and going away in their exits, remaining in their living states and acquiring their ends, and forever running back and forth in their repeated birth and death in this world. Chapter 37. Upasama, stillness of the soul, apparent activity of the mind. Vasistha added, in this manner these series of worlds are revolving in their unchanging course, repeatedly appearing and disappearing in the substantiality of Brahman. All this is derived from the one self-existence. All this has become the reciprocal cause of one another by their mutual transformations, and again they are destroyed of themselves by their mutual destructiveness of one another. But as the motion of the waters on the surface does not affect the waters in the depth of the sea, so the fluctuations of the changing scenes of nature make no alteration in the ever-tranquil spirit of Brahman. As a desert in summer heat presents the waters of a mirage to a clear sky, so the false world shows its delusive appearance to the mind. As the calm soul seems to be giddy in the state of one's drunkenness, so the essence of consciousness, which is always the same, appears as otherwise in its ignorance. The world is neither reality nor unreality. It is situated in consciousness, but appears to be placed outside of it. It is not separate from the soul, although it seems to be different from it, as the ornament appears to differ from its gold. Rama, that soul of yours, whereby you perceive form and figure and sound and smell, is the supreme Brahman pervading all things. The pure soul, being one in many and inherent in all external objects, cannot be thought of as being different from those that appear other than itself. Rama, it is the difference of human thoughts that judges differently of the existence and non-existence of things, and of their good and bad nature also. It judges the world to exist either within or outside the divine spirit. Because it is impossible for anything to exist outside the Spirit of God, it was the Spirit that willed to become many. As there was nothing beside itself which it could think of or find for itself, it was necessary that it became so of itself without the aid of any extraneous matter. Therefore the will to do this or that, or try for one another or other, does not relate to the soul but to the mind. Thus the soul, without choice, having no will of its own, does nothing except think on what is in itself. It is not an active agent owing to the union of all agency, instrumentally and objectively in itself. It abides nowhere, being both the recipient and content, the container and the contained of everything in itself. Neither is the will-less soul actionless, when the acts of creation are perceptible in itself, nor is it possible that there is any other cause of them. Rama, you must know the nature of Brahman to be no other than this. Knowing him as no agent and without a second, be free from all anxiety. I will tell you more, though you may continue to do a great many acts here, yet tell me in a word what you do that is worth doing. Rely on the lack of your own agency and be quiet as the wise sage. Remain as calm and still as the clear ocean when unshaken by breeze. Know well that it is not possible for the swiftest runners to reach their goal of perfection, no matter how far they may run. You must desist in your mind from pursuing worldly objects and persist to meditate on the spirituality of your inner intellectual soul. Chapter 38. The same stillness of spirit, the mind as an agent. Vasistha resumed, such being the state of the wise, the actions they are seen to do, whether of goodness or otherwise, or pleasurable or painful, and regardless of what they are engaged in, are false and as nothing, and do not affect them as they do other worldly mortals. For what is a person's action other than the exertion of mental and voluntary energies, with a fixed determination and desire of performing some physical act? The action of a man is defined to be the production of an act by appliance of the proper means, the exertion and action of the body in conformity with one's ability, and the completion of the effect compatible with one's intention, together with the enjoyment of the results of such agency. Moreover, whether a man is agent or no agent of an action, and whether he goes to heaven or dwells in hell, his mind is subject to the same feeling as the desire he has in his heart. Hence the agency of the ignorant arises from their wishing to do a thing, whether they do it or not. But not so of the wise, who, having no will, are not culpable even for their involuntary actions. Untutored minds are full with the weeds of vice, but well-cultivated souls are quite devoid of them. He who has the knowledge of truth becomes relaxed in his earthly desire, though he acts his part well. He does not long eagerly for its result like others do. He acts with his body, but with a quiet, unconcerned mind. When successful, he attributes the gain of the will to God. When the worldly-minded aggregate the results to themselves, though they could not bring it about. Whatever the mind intends truly comes to pass, and nothing is achieved without the application of the mind. Therefore, agency belongs to the mind and not to the body. The world proceeds from the divine mind. The world is a development of the mind, and it is situated in the infinite and eternal mind. Knowing all things to be manifestation of the power of consciousness, the wise man remains cool in his desire. The minds of those who know the soul come to the state of perfect detachment from their desires, just as when a false mirage of water is set down by raining clouds, and particles of morning dew are dried up by the raging sun. It is then that the soul is said to rest in its perfect bliss, turiya. This is not the joy of the gusto of pleasure or the pain of sorrow or discontent. It does not consist of the liveliness of living beings or the inertness of stones. It is not situated in the midst of these opposites, but in a knowing mind, which is all rapture and ecstasy, infinite bliss. But the thirst of an ignorant mind leads to a moving water of earthly pleasure, just like an elephant is misled to a full pool where he is plunged into its mud and mire without finding anything that is really good. Here's another example based on a stanza in the Scriptures which says, "A man dreaming himself to be fallen into a pit, feels the fear of his fall in his imagination, even when he has been sleeping in his bed. But another who actually falls in the pit when he is fast asleep is quite unconscious of his fall. Thus it is the mind which paints its own pleasure and pain, and not the bodily actions or its inactivity. Hence, whether a man is the doer of an action or not, he perceives nothing of it when his mind is engrossed in some other thought or action. But he sees everything within himself who beholds everything in the abstract meditation of his mind. The thinking mind sees outward objects as reflections that are cast out from his pure consciousness. Thus the mind, knowing the knowable mind, knows himself to be inaccessible to the feeling of pleasure and pain. Knowing this as a certainty, he finds that nothing exists apart from what is within the container of his soul, which is as minute as the 1,000th part of a hair. This being ascertained, he views everything in himself. With this certainty of knowledge, he comes to know the self as a reflection of all things, present in all of them. After these determinations, he comes to the conclusion that he is not subject to pain or pleasure. Thus freed from anxiety, the mind freely exercises its power over all customary duties without being concerned about them. He who knows the self remains joyous even as calamity and shines like the moonlight which enlightens the world. He knows that it is in his mind and not his self that is the agent of his action, although he is the doer of them. Knowing that the mind is the agent in all his actions, he does not assume to himself the merit of the exercise of his limbs, hands, and feet, nor does he accept to reap the rewards of all his constant labor and act. Unrestrained minds become unrestrained agents, their mental actions or thoughts become habits, and their endurance brings about their consequence. Thus the mind is the root of all effort and exertion, of all act and actions, of all their results and productions, and the source of suffering, the consequent of action. By doing away with your mind, you make a clean sweep of all your actions and thereby avoid all your miseries resulting from your acts. All these are at an end where the trance of the mind is at an end. It is a practice in yoga to relieve the excitement of the mind from its ever-varying purposes. See how a boy is led by the fancy of his mind to build his toy or hobby horse, which he dresses and paints in his willful play, without showing any concern or feeling of pleasure in playing, in its making or its breaking, however he pleases. So does man build his aerial castles, and level it without any sense of gain or loss. It is by his acting in this manner in all worldly matters that no man is spiritually entangled in them. Amidst the dangers and delights of this world, what causes can there be for your sorrow other than you have the one and not the other? But what is there so delectable and delightful to be desired in this world that at the same time is not impermanent and perishable? Only yourself, your soul, which is neither the active nor the passive agent of your actions and enjoyment, although people attribute actions and their fruitions to it by their error. The importance of actions and emotions to living beings is a mistake and not a veritable truth. If we consider things correctly, we find no action or emotion having any relationship to the soul. Only the sensualist feels attachment or aversion to the senses and conscious actions and enjoyments, and not those who are detached from sensuous affections. There is no liberation in this world for the worldly minded, while liberation is fully realized by the yogi whose mind, in its state of living liberation, jiva mukta, is free from attachment to the world. Though the sage is established in the light of his self-consciousness, yet he is aware of the distinction between unity and duality, the true entity from the non-entities, and he sees the omnipotence and all power that are displayed in nature. To him there is no bond or freedom, no liberation or bondage whatever, and the miseries of ignorance are all lost in the light of his enlightenment. It is in vain to wish for liberation when the mind is tied down to the earth, so it is redundant to talk of bondage when the mind is already fastened to it. Shun them both by ignoring your individual ego and remain fixed to the true ego. Continue in this way to manage yourself with an unruffled mind on this earth. Chapter 39. Vasistha postpones the question of impurity from purity, the unity of all things. Rama replied, "Tell me, O high-minded sage, how could creation proceed from the supreme Brahma, whom you describe as remaining as still as a painting in the canvas of emptiness?" Vasistha replied, "O prince, such is the nature of Brahma that all power constantly flows from him. Therefore every power is said to reside in him. In him resides entity and non-entity. In him there is unity, duality, and plurality, and the beginning and end of all things. This is one and nothing else. It is like the sea whose water have endless varieties of shapes. It represents the images of myriads of stars in its bosom, rising spontaneously of themselves. As consciousness becomes dense, it makes the mind, and the mind brings forth all the powers of thinking, willing, and acting. These it produces, accumulates, contains, shows, and then absorbs in itself. Brahman is the source of all living beings, and of all things seen all around us. His power is the cause that exhibits all things in their constant course or quiescence. All things spring from the Supreme Spirit, and they reside in his all-comprehensive mind. They are of the same nature as that of their source, like the water of the sweet and salt lake. Rama interrupted and said, Sage, your discourse is very dark, and I cannot understand the meaning of what you are saying. There is the nature of Brahma, which you said to be beyond the perception of the mind and senses. Then what are these perishable things which you say have proceeded from him? If your reasoning comes to this conclusion, then I cannot rely upon it. It is the law of production that anything produced from something is invariably of the same nature with that of its producer. As light is produced from light, grain comes from grain, and man is born of man, and all kinds come out of their own kind. Therefore the production of the immutable spirit must also be unchangeable and spiritual in its nature. Besides all this, the intellectual spirit of God is pure and immaculate. This creation is all impure and gross matter. Upon hearing these words, the great sage said, Brahman is all purity, and there is no impurity in him. The waves moving on the surface of the sea may be foul, but they do not soil the waters of the deep. Rama, you cannot conceive of there being a second person or thing beside the one Brahma, just as you can have no conception of fire beside its heat. Rama replied, Sage, Brahman is devoid of sorrow, while the world is full of sorrow. Therefore I cannot clearly understand your words when you say this to be the offspring of that. Valmiki said to Bharadwaja, At these words of Rama, the great sage Vasistha remained silent. He stopped his lecture and contemplated. His mind lost its accustomed clarity. Then, recovering its clear vision, he pondered within himself in the following manner. The educated and intelligent mind that has known the Knowable One has reached the end of the subject of liberation by its own reasoning and intuition, as that of Rama. It is no fault of the educated to have questions until it is explained to them to their full satisfaction, as in the case of Rama. The half-educated are not fit to receive spiritual instructions because their view of phenomena, which dwells on obvious objects, proves to be the cause of their ruin. But he who has come to understand in a transcendental light, and who has a clear insight of spiritual truth, feels no desire for sensual enjoyment, and instead advances in course of time to the conclusion that Brahma is all in all things. If the mind is pure, it constantly comprehends the truth. First, the disciple has to be prepared and purified with the teaching and practice of stillness and self-control. Then he is to be initiated in the creed that all this is Brahman, and you are that pure spirit. But whoso teaches the faith of all is Brahman to a half-taught and ignorant truly entangles him in the strong snare of hell. The well-discerning sage should tell only those who are enlightened in their understanding, whose desire of sensual gratification is abated, and who are free from their worldly desires, who are cleansed of the dirt of their ignorance, and who are prepared to receive religious and spiritual instruction. The spiritual guide who instructs his student without weighing well his habits and conduct is a silly teacher and sinks into hell and has to dwell there until the last day of judgment. The venerable Vasistha, who was the chief of sages, and like the bright sun of the earth, having considered these things, spoke to Rama as follows. Vasistha said, I will tell you, Rama, at the conclusion of this lecture, whether the attribution of the impurity of gross bodies is applicable to Brahman or not. For now, know that Brahma is almighty, all-pervading, omnipresent, and is all himself. Because of omnipotence, he can do and becomes all and everything of itself. You see various practices of magicians and tricks of jugglers in producing, presenting, and hiding many things in the sight of men. These are all only unreal shows. In the same way, Brahman produces, presents, and removes all things from and into himself. The world is filled with gardens like those in fairylands, and the sky is full with the airy councils of Gandharvas in the abode of God. Men are seen to descend from the cloudless sky to the surface on the earth and rise upward to heaven, flying chariots. Fairy cities like the palaces of the Gandharvas of the ethereal regions are shown on earth and filled with the fairies of fairyland. Whatever there is or has been or is to be in this world are all like reflections of the revolving sky and heavenly bodies, or of a brass ball affixed to the top of a tower and darting its golden light below. All these are only exhibitions of the various forms of manifestation of the selfsame God. Whatever takes place at any time or in any place and any form is only a variety of the one self-existent reality. Therefore why, O Rama, should you give vent to your sorrow or joy, or wonder at any change of time or place of nature and form of things? They are all full of the Spirit of God and exhibit the endless aspects of the infinite mood. Like the intelligent preserve the sameness of their minds and dispositions amidst all changes, knowing them to be the varying conditions of the same unvarying mind. He who seizes God in all and is filled with equanimity has no cause for surprise, grief, or delight, or any other fluctuations of his mind in response to any change in nature or the ups and downs of his fortune. In all the variations of time and place, and in all external circumstance, the unaltered mind continues to see the varieties of the power of his Maker. The Lord proposes these plans in the formation of his creation, and exhibits as the sea does its waves in endless varieties in succession from the fullness of his mind. So the Lord manifests the power situated in himself, as the sea does its waves in itself, as milk forms butter, as earth produced earthenware, or thread is woven into cloth. The fig tree bears fruit its forth, and all varied forms are contained in their sources. But these changes in form are phenomena and not real. They are mere appearance of the spectrum, like those of apparitions and phantoms. There is no agent or object, no actor or act, or anything which is acted upon, nor is there anything that becomes nothing except by the variety of one unity. The mind that witnesses spiritual truth and retains its calmness unimpaired and unaffected by external accidents comes to see the light of truth by itself. If there is a lamp, there is light also. The sun shining brings the day with him. Where there is a flower, there is its fragrance. So where there is a living soul, there is a knowledge of the world. The world appearing all around is like the light of the soul. It appears like the motion of the wind, on which we have no notion of its reality or unreality. The immaculate soul is the prime power of the appearance and disappearance of the myriads of gross bodies, which, like the revolving stars of the sky and the seasonal flowers of spring, appear and reappear to us by turns, like the ups and downs of wheels in motion. All things die away when our souls are without us, but how can anything be nothing when we are in possession of our own souls? All things appear before us in the presence of our souls, and they vanish before us in their absence from the body. Everything is born with us, with our souls, and is lost with loss of them. The living have all, but the dead are lost to view. The human soul, when joined with the divine, has a clear view of everything. The minds of men are endowed with their knowledge at their very birth. Then, growing bigger by degrees in course of time, they expand themselves into the form of the spacious forest of the world. The woods of the world are the fastening post of the soul, where our blossoming desires are filled with fruits of poignant grief. It branches out with gratifications, blossoms with old age, and is breaking its good post and wandering at large of its free will. Therefore, Rama, cut off the tree of worldly existence, samsara, with the sword of discrimination. Chapter 40. Identity of the world with Brahman, using words. Rama said, "Tell me, sage, about the production of animal beings from Brahman, and let me know their different names and natures in full length." Vasistha replied, "I will tell you in brief the manner in which different species of beings are produced from Brahman, and how they are destroyed afterwards, and also how they attain their liberation in the end, also the manner of their growth and sustenance and fitness in the world. The omnipotent energy, Chit Shakti, of the consciousness of Brahma becomes whatever is thought of Chetya in divine consciousness. The exercise of consciousness becomes condensed to a certain subtle form, which, having the powers of thought, becomes the principle called the mind. Then the mind, by an effort of its own conception, called the will, expands itself to an unreal, ideal scenery like that of the fairyland, by falling off from the nature of thoughtlessness that is Brahman. Consciousness, when remaining in its original state, appears as a vacuum or space, but upon manifesting itself in the form of the mind, men see it as the visible sky. Taking the conception of the lotus born, it finds itself in its conceived form of the lotus, God Brahma, the Creator, and then it thinks of creation in the form of Prajapati, or Lord of Creatures. He then formed this creation from his thought, Chitta. It contains the 14 worlds with all the multitudes and varieties of living beings in them. The mind itself is an emptiness with an empty body. Thought is the mind's field of its action, and its sphere is full with the false workings of the mind. In the mind of Brahma there are many kinds of beings, some laboring under great ignorance like beasts and brute creatures. There are some with enlightened souls and minds such as the sages, others stagger in the intermediate class like the majority of mankind. Among all living beings confined in this earth, only the human race living in the past India are capable of receiving instructions and civilization. But most of these are subject to disease and distress, suffering under the thrall of their ignorance, enmity, and fear. Therefore it is for their benefit that I will deliver my lecture on social and saintly conduct. I will also talk about the everlasting, imperishable, and omnipresent Brahman, who is without beginning or end, whose mind is without error, and who is of the form of intellectual light. I will explain how endless beings are put to motion by the momentum of a particle of his motionless body, resembling the rolling of a boisterous waves on the surface of a clear and tranquil ocean. Rama asked, Sage, how can there be a part of the infinite spirit, or a momentum of the motionless God, or a change or effort from one who is altogether without them? Vasistha replied, It is the usual and current mode of expression, both in scripture and language, for people to talk in terms of, all this is made by or come from him, but it is not so in its real and spiritual sense. No change or partition and no relation of space or time bears any reference to the Supreme, who is unchangeable, infinite, and eternal. There is no appearance or disappearance of him at any time or place, who is ever invisible everywhere. There never was, nor can there ever be, any way of representing the incomprehensible except by symbolical expression. Therefore I have made use of words that are used in common speech. Whatever words or expressions are used as symbolic of some sense, whether they express produced form, taja, or change of the same, tanmaya, the same should be used in that sense all along. It is taja when we say fire proceeds from fire, meaning the mundane Brahma comes out of the spiritual Brahma. Here fire is symbolical of Brahma in the world. It is tanmaya in the expression Brahma is the producer and produced, meaning the identity and transformation of the Creator to the creation. The first expression is applied to the world as proceeding from Brahma, but the other expression, that of the producer and produced, also means the creative power which made the world. The expression, this is one thing and that another, idam anyat, is false. The difference is verbal and not real because there is no proof of it in the nature of God, which is one and all. The mind, by reason of its birth, taja, from Brahma, possesses both the power and intelligence of his consciousness, and is enabled to accomplish its intended purpose by means of its intense application. To say that one flame of fire produces the other is mere word dispute. There is no truth in this assertion. That one produces the other is also false reasoning, because the one Brahma, being infinite, could produce no other thing besides reproducing himself. It is the nature of argument to contradict each another by replies and rejoinders, but it is not right to defeat an adversary by false reasoning. The learned know Brahma as the ocean rolling in its endless waves, and significant words and their meanings go together like Brahman and his creation. Brahman is consciousness, Brahman is the mind, Brahman is intelligence, and Brahman is substance, vastu. He is sound, he is understanding, and he is in the principle of things. The whole universe is Brahman, and yet he is beyond all this. In reality, the world is a nothing, for all is Brahman alone. This is one thing, and that is another, and this is a part of the great soul, are all contradictory assertions of ignorance. No words can express the true nature of the unknown. The spirit rises as the flame of fire, and this flame signifies the mind. Its tremor signifies the fluctuation of the mind, which in reality is not the case, there being no rise or fall of the divine mind. It is untruth that wavers and equivocates in double meanings. It deviates from the truth as a defective eye sees a double moon in the sky. Brahman being all of himself and all-pervading and infinite of his own nature, there can be no other thing beside himself, and anything that is produced of him is likewise himself. Beside the truth of the existence of Brahman, there is nothing which can be proved as absolutely certain. It is a scriptural truth that says, truly all this is Brahman. This also must be a conclusion which you will arrive at by your reasoning, and which I will propose with many examples and teachings in the book of Nirvana, Liberation. The single question raises many things of which you are ignorant. You will come to know fully in the future, and your questions on this subject will be dispelled. Unreality having disappeared, reality appears to view. Just as the darkness of night being dispelled, the visible world comes to sight. The spacious world which appears to your false sight will vanish, O Rama, on your attainment of the state of calm stillness. False appearances must disappear from your vision as soon as the light of truth comes to dawn upon your soul.